Welcome, everyone. This is your friend, the DN What If, here with another exciting fanfiction. Today, we're diving into the story of What If Deku Couldn't Survive Todoroki's One Question? If you enjoy this video, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more fanfiction content just like this. Now, let's get started with the fanfic. Don't you think Bakugo is pretty? Todoroki looked up after having apparently caused the untimely deaths of his three friends. Uraraka was doubled over, clutching her throat as bits of food sprayed from her wheezing mouth. Ida had somehow mini-recipro bursted his way through the floorboards and was struggling to get back out of the crater, and Midoriya looked like he needed an ambulance. Or an immediate blood transfusion at least, his face was so white. Todoroki glanced across the cafeteria, eyes drawn as they always were to the abomination of a human being that was currently screaming bloody murder at his classmates. On default, proud. Seeing Bakugo's lips stretched back so far into a murderous snarl, Todoroki could count every single one of his perfectly straight, pearly white teeth. So, a very common expression, he guessed he couldn't blame his friends for their overblown shock at his comment. Todoroki looked back down at his food as the telltale crackle of mini-explosions went off on his far right, and a strangled, spluttering sound emitted from his left as Midoriya appeared to slowly drag his soul back into his body. Forcibly, Todoroki cut a small piece of meat and raised it to his mouth to muffle his quiet mumble. Just me. Bakugo Katsuki made one hell of a first impression on possibly everyone that had ever seen him. Even in the rare moments when Todoroki hadn't seen the trademark scowl on his face, usually when nobody was breathing in his direction to piss him off, just his spiky shock of blonde hair and sharp, blood-red eyes were enough to draw attention. And, of course, usually he was either blowing someone's face up, threatening very loudly to do so, or stomping around, probably said that he wasn't currently wiping the floor with someone's obliterated remains. Okay, Bakugo hadn't actually killed anyone before, and despite the amount of times Todoroki had heard him very explicitly tell Midoriya to die, Todoroki knew Bakugo never would. But, you kinda got the feeling that the guy liked to bathe in kitten's blood every time he opened that foul, unnecessarily loud mouth. So yeah, out of all possible words any sane person would use to describe Bakugo Katsuki, pretty wasn't a popular choice. Todoroki couldn't help it, though. It was Bakugo's fault. And his own awful tastes, apparently. He wished he could say it was when he saw Bakugo smile rather than smirk for the first time or something, or seeing his face soften after saving a puppy from drowning, or something that made sense. Unfortunately, he still had yet to see the aggressive boy smile, let alone save people or animals without yelling at them. It was actually when he was brushing his teeth one morning in the boys' bathroom. Bakugo walked in with a huge yawn and sleepy dust crusting his bleary, squinty eyes, looking like a sleepy, angry mess instead of just the standard angry mess, and Todoroki suddenly lost all his brain cells and wanted to kiss. And then Bakugo shot him a murderous glare and told him to keep his DMN creepy eyes to himself. Todoroki knew he sometimes came across as creepy, because when he was interested by something he would stare at it indefinitely. It still made him a little dejected to hear it from Bakugo though, and he glanced away with a quiet, "Oh." That must have set the guy off more because Bakugo then proceeded to choke and swear and blow up a chunk of the sink. Todoroki didn't look directly at him for a while after that. Todoroki had thought about Bakugo before that, sure. How could you possibly not spare a passing thought or two for the literally explosive, brilliant, powerful ball of pure assholery that came first in the entrance exam, first in the sports festival, and scored closely behind Ida and Yaoyorozu to place third in the class for academic grades despite looking like a brainless delinquent. And that was just in their first year. But up until recently Todoroki had been preoccupied with his own less than pleasant issues that he still hadn't fully shaken off, though he liked to think he was a bit more at peace with himself and the world in general now. Plus, he was self-aware enough to acknowledge that he was a bit of an a-hole as well. Frankly, he hadn't cared much about other people before Midoriya entered his life. His passing thoughts about Bakugo had remained just that, added with a dash of disdain for his brash, rude behavior. But now that he actually slowed down and took his time to notice other people around him, and tried to come out of his shell, a little, as Uraraka had put it, well. Apparently he'd had to sacrifice his sight and general sanity in exchange for the positivity in his life. Well, objectively speaking, Bakugo wasn't bad-looking. In fact, when he was only moderately frowning, he was a pretty attractive guy. The questionable thing was that Todoroki found even his crazed, bloodthirsty grins in battle as he screamed at some poor soul to go to hell, attractive. Todoroki generally thought himself to be a rational, reasonable guy. He didn't place much importance on other people's opinions of him, but he knew most people would describe him as cool-headed. There was probably a pun in there somewhere that Todoroki couldn't be bothered acknowledging, but the point was, he and other people were clearly under a misconception that his brain was functioning normally. Todoroki-kun, are you thinking about Bakugo-kun again? Uraraka sounded apprehensive, her wobbly, half-concerned, half-hesitantly supportive smile mirroring Midoriya's. They both tended to look at him like that a lot, whenever he spaced out, and it was all too obvious what was on his mind. Like they weren't sure exactly how to tell Todoroki that the object of his affections was practically a fire-breathing monster. Well, thankfully for him, fire was on his side. Though explosions weren't too far off from fire, he mused. What do you think it'd be like to hold his hand? It'd probably be sweaty. His quirk activates from his sweat after all, so to be able to use it at will like he does, Todoroki wondered aloud, half to himself, and artfully ignored Ida choking on thin air beside him. It was a common reaction whenever any sentence concerning Bakugo left Todoroki's mouth. Todoroki-kun, you think about holding Kaken's hand? Midoriya sounded like he was confirming whether Todoroki liked sticking thorns into his own eyeball. Todoroki looked down at his own outstretched hand and imagined warm, strong fingers wrapped around it. In reality, those warm, strong fingers would sooner break his hand in half than hold it, but fantasies came unbidden anyway. I think about it a concerning amount of time every day, yeah. Maybe I should try it and see. So I stopped thinking about it. Todoroki replied pensively, and again ignored Ida's choke. Uraraka and Midoriya stared at him for a very long time in silence, and Todoroki could hear them trying to decide whether or not to point out to him that attempting to hold Bakugo Katsuki's hand was a surefire way to lose an entire limb. Uraraka eventually said, "At least you know it's concerning." In Todoroki's weak defense, he was just curious about a lot of things to do with Bakugo. He was curious about holding Bakugo's hand, just as he was curious to see what his face would look like when laughing in genuine amusement. He was curious about Bakugo's obsession with winning, he was curious about Bakugo's grudge against Midoriya, he was curious about Bakugo's purposefully unlikable, unapproachable demeanor, he was curious about the strange but definitely substantial bond between Bakugo and Kirishima, he was curious about so many things. Over time, he'd spiraled from thinking, "Sheet, he's pretty," as Bakugo scowled at the mirror while casually obliterating his teeth with his toothbrush, to being unable to keep thoughts of the aggressive fireball out of his head whenever he wasn't focused on training. He'd actually only first voiced aloud any thoughts about Bakugo and his very subjective prettiness recently, though the thoughts had been plaguing his mind for a good several months or so. When he first started thinking about him, he'd thought he'd finally gone and lost it and hadn't wanted to infect Midoriya and his other friends with whatever illness had clearly struck him, but it just slipped out a few weeks ago and, well, though the reactions had been comical and in all ways negative, none of them had teased him for it. And now, it was like the proverbial dam had been broken. He wasn't known for being a very chatty person at all, but now in comparison to his usual aloof self, he just wouldn't shut up about Bakugo. The sad thing was, with all his time spent thinking about him, Todoroki hadn't actually spoken to Bakugo himself at all. That was hardly surprising, they were barely friends. Bakugo had simmered down quite a bit in their third year. Now as compared to when they first entered UA, Todoroki liked to think Bakugo viewed him as a classmate and rival now, rather than another nameless enemy he had to bulldoze through on his way to reaching his goal of greatest hero. But both of them were fantastically horrible at social interactions. Well, Bakugo chose to be, and their respective friends had surrounded them of their own will. In all honesty, he really didn't know why he wanted to be Bakugo's friend in the first place. He couldn't imagine it was a very easy or healthy job. He had no idea what it'd be like to talk to him or to hang out with him, since he only knew the trash talk Bakugo would spit down at him whenever they sparred for training in class. He only knew the sense of exhilaration, adrenaline, and challenge rushing through his veins whenever he fought him, his toughest, most evenly matched opponent, and let a wide, teeth-baring grin of his own slip onto his face when he forced a gleam of respect and cautiousness into those blazing red eyes with his own power. Other than that, he and Bakugo had exchanged only a handful of words before, usually just pointless, snarky remarks at each other. Although the snark definitely weighed more prominently on Bakugo's end, it wasn't to say just because Todoroki didn't talk much meant he wasn't a fan of sharp-tongued banter. Plus, it was always funny pissing him off. Maybe it was just that addicting rush that spurred him to take the initiative and commence Mission Impossible. He had no idea how to begin expressing that he wanted to be friends to Bakugo of all people, who only barely tolerated Kirishima on some days and only put up with the rest of the Baku squad, because their persistence tired him out, it appeared. Okay, no, he knew that Bakugo actually did care about his friends, but that was the general vibe. Todoroki had neither the bubbliness nor the energy that group shared, enabling them to plaster themselves at Bakugo's side without being sent to the hospital, but persistence and tenacity was something he had in droves. Determination as well. Bakugo, can we be friends? Huh. Okay, yeah, that's exactly what Todoroki had expected. He kept his face neutral, not that he had to try, watching Bakugo's blood pressure visibly skyrocket. He'd expected this from the guy that genuinely wanted to call himself King Explosion Murder, so he wasn't upset or taken aback at all as Bakugo cursed and spat at him as if Todoroki just insulted his family. The F were you playing at, Halfie? Bakugo yelled, demonstrating the impressive maximum volume his voice was capable of making as per usual. Todoroki wasn't sure which part Bakugo was the angriest at, that Todoroki presumed to want to be friends, that Todoroki was implying Bakugo deigned to even have friends, that Todoroki had asked him so bluntly, or maybe just at Todoroki himself. I'm not playing at anything. I just want to be your friend. Todoroki replied evenly, and Bakugo stared at him like he'd grown a second head. In hindsight, Todoroki was glad he'd chosen to stop Bakugo on their way back to the dorms, standing off to the side of the path lit up by the setting sun, rather than subject his classmates to Bakugo's rage inside the dorms as well as everywhere else. Effing why? The question was as aggressive as everything else, not a shred of insecurity or self-deprecation in his aggravated tone. He was really just confused in that Bakugo way of ever-present anger, as to why Todoroki wanted to be friends. It reassured him, for some bizarre reason. Beats me. Todoroki let out a barely there snort, and Bakugo looked like he was less than a second away from blowing himself up out of sheer irritation. Are you FNG around with me, Candy Cane? You just here to waste my time? Thought you actually had something important to say, never thought you'd joke around for no reason. Don't fucking speak to me, get lost. Bakugo yelled, snarled and growled all at once in that spectacular Bakugo fashion, and at that, Todoroki couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. Not that he'd expected anything better. So, that's a no? Todoroki asked quietly, putting in a bit more effort to maintain his blank expression. But something must have slipped through, as Bakugo stiffened, and his slanted red eyes narrowed. For a tense moment, they just stared at each other, and Todoroki watched the piercing light of the golden sun catch in equally piercing red irises. Though a little upset at the rejection and uncomfortable by the way Bakugo scrutinized him, Todoroki didn't let his gaze waver, not backing down from the unspoken challenge for a second. Then Bakugo must have come to some conclusion and let out a long-suffering sigh, curling his lip and messing with his hair irritatedly. The F is wrong with you, waltzing up all of a sudden and asking me to be effing friends with that stupid empty expression. What was I supposed to? Bakugo pinched the bridge of his nose and paused to just look at Todoroki for a second more. Then he said in a quick angry little mutter, the calmest Todoroki had ever heard that voice speak to him before. We're not friends, alright? ANG half and half BS dirty. Stop looking at me like that. Jesus. Then he turned and stomped his way to the dorms, shoulders hunched, posture terrible as always. Todoroki was left standing there feeling like the very ground just got pulled out from under him. He almost swooned, but he decided to save himself the remaining bit of his dignity today. We're not friends? Midoriya echoed slowly and Todoroki nodded. A second of silence ticked by, and Midoriya leant back on his palms, breath escaping him in a rush. Wow. That's pretty much a love confession, coming from Kaken. Midoriya spoke dryly, making Todoroki choke despite himself. Love soon dash? Don't put it that way, it's bad for me. Todoroki muttered, and Midoriya shot him a sympathetic look with just a slight edge of hysteria. So what exactly do you want to, do about Kaken? You like him, right? Midoriya asked hesitantly and Todoroki blanked. He guessed Midoriya meant that in a non-platonic sense. He liked him, right? There was no other reason to think about what it'd be like to kiss him, after all. No other reason to wonder what Bakugo would be like if he were dating someone, wondering, maybe hoping, whether he'd be a little softer with them. But really, all he knew about Bakugo was that he yelled at everyone and acted like he hated the world in general. How could he like someone like that? Todoroki was not an impulsive person, and he definitely didn't fall for people easily. In fact, he'd never thought about anyone like this before, so why Mr. Blasty Explodo Killna case? Oh God, he's such a terrible person. Todoroki buried his head in his hands and groaned in defeat, the more he thought about Bakugo's personality. That was admission enough, he guessed. Great, he liked the amazingly rude, arrogant a-hole. For no reason. What was he even drawn to? Kaken is overly aggressive and angry and proud, and quite cruel with his words to other people sometimes, sure. But do you really think he's a terrible person? Midoriya asked, his voice suddenly taking on a knowing, perceptive lilt. Todoroki looked up at that and frowned, shaking his head even though Midoriya's soft smile made it feel like he'd been baited. He's not a bad person. He has his own morals and ideals and he sticks to them without allowing anyone or anything to change him. He tries just as hard as you and me to become the strongest hero, and he tries harder than anyone else to be the best he can be at everything else. And it's not for shallow things like compliments or recognition. He doesn't care what other people think of him, he only does it to reach his own impossible standards of himself. He's been compared to villains by pretty much everyone before, but even when he was given the opportunity to become one, he never considered it even for a second. He's so honest and straightforward, he'd never do anything behind our backs, or resort to dirty tricks in battle. He yells at everyone, sure, but he's improved a lot now. He actually cares about Kirishima, and gets along with his group in his own way. I'm sure he cares about us too. Whenever he fights alongside other people, he takes care to alter his attacks so they don't get hurt. He's so sure of himself and puts his all into his goals and dreams. Todoroki trailed off, his monotonous rant probably sounding a lot like Midoriya's usual mumblings. Sheet, that was the most he'd spoken in longer than he could remember, and I like him, don't I? Todoroki finished a little lamely, and Midoriya just gave him a nod and an even softer smile. Other than Midoriya, Ida and Uraraka, the group he usually hung out with, Todoroki was also very good friends with Yaoyorozu in a very casual, low-maintenance sort. She wasn't a part of their circle, but he'd gotten really close with her ever since they were paired together against Aizawa in their first year. She was actually the only person outside of his family that called him by his first name, other than in his hero names context. He still called her Yaoyorozu just because it was more comfortable for him, just like how he still called Midoriya by his last name. Even though his class had gotten so close, he was almost certain some would open hero agencies together once they graduated. A lot of them were like that. Probably only Kaminari and Kirishima, Kaminari and Ishido, Midoriya and Bakugo, sort of, Bakugo and Ishido, Todoroki and Yaoyorozu, and then all the girls were on first-name basis. I thought you had to tutor Jairu and Siro right now. Todoroki handed Yaoyorozu a vanilla eclair he picked up on the way back to the dorms from the hospital, and Yaoyorozu smiled her thanks. They were always buying each other their favorite snacks, not that Todoroki, or Yaoyorozu he was sure, did it on purpose. He would just tend to always pass some cafe or bakery and see something she'd like. In their second year, apparently half of the class had been convinced that they were actually dating, but really, she was more like a sister. Well, midterms are still a while away after all, and Kyuka and Shiro-san have never been the most motivated. They went out with Mina's group to an arcade. I am worried though, Kyuka was really struggling with English. Yaoyorozu sighed and peeled open the wrapper. Todoroki hummed at that, sticking his straw into his matcha milk tea. He put a hand in his pocket and leaned against the wall, wondering if he should ask Yaoyorozu for help with English too. He'd probably be fine on his own since academic tests had never been a problem for him, but it couldn't hurt seeing as English wasn't his strong point, and he knew Yaoyorozu loved teaching others. It's okay. They'll start panicking in about a week and come crying to you as always. Todoroki spoke around his straw, giving her a dry, sympathetic look. Yaoyorozu returned it with a raised eyebrow. That's exactly what I was trying to avoid by scheduling a study session earlier rather than later. Yaoyorozu sighed, moving to lean against the wall beside him. Todoroki paused and watched her for a second as she took a bite of her eclair. Yaoyorozu wasn't the type to get hurt just because she got cancelled on, but he knew how excited she got about these study sessions. Are you upset? Todoroki asked softly just to make sure. Yaoyorozu flashed him an understanding smile. No, not really. It wasn't set in stone, and besides, Kyuka apologized so much just before that I had to shoo her out the door. Yaoyorozu laughed and shook her head fondly. What about you? Are you studying with anyone for midterms? I'm supposed to help Uraraka, Azui and Tokoyami with maths tomorrow after school. Todoroki replied, internally wincing as he'd completely forgotten about that till she mentioned it just now. Oh, Mina said she and Kaminari-san are studying maths after school tomorrow with Bakugu-san. Why don't you two teach everyone at the same time? Yaoyorozu suggested, and Todoroki immediately foresaw yelling, injuries, and Bakugu picking unnecessary fights with him. They'd never seen eye to eye with anything involving a method after all, i.e. battle strategies or even how best to load the dishwasher. I've seen Bakugu tutoring Kirishima before. It was pretty violent, so I think I'll pass. Todoroki muttered dryly, and Yaoyorozu laughed again, shrugging. That is a fair point. Todoroki drank his milk tea in silence for a few moments, thinking it over again. He and Bakugu had reached an unspoken agreement ages ago to avoid working together as much as possible. It just wasn't efficient and annoyed the both of them, after all. Even if Todoroki's attitude towards Bakugu had changed, he still hadn't reached out to try any sort of teamwork with him since maybe the start of their second year. Would it be different now? Would Bakugu be willing to listen a little and cooperate more now? He knew Bakugu was able to successfully lead a team. His keen battle sense let him make on-the-spot decisions to utilize his abilities and everyone around him to achieve impressive results, just like Todoroki's intellect allowed him to do so. But he and Bakugu had been terribly incompatible as allies back then unless they were in a life-or-death situation against villain attacks, and even then it had been bumpy at best. And their thoughts and very natures clashed on everyday mundane things involving living together at the dorm. He just accepted that and barely gave it any more thought. As long as they were able to fight alongside each other as heroes if need be, nothing else really mattered. But it was different now. As Bakugu had said, they weren't not friends. Todoroki wanted to be more amicable towards him now. Would Bakugu also attempt at better communication? Todoroki chewed on his straw, slowly. Say, hypothetically, how would I know if I liked someone? Todoroki asked, staring straight ahead absently. Yaoyorozu almost jumped at the question and turned to him in surprise. Shudo, you like someone? Yaoyorozu gasped, and Todoroki slid her a flat look. Hypothetically. Todoroki repeated firmly, as if it were actually true. Yaoyorozu lifted a hand and rested her bent finger against her chin in thought. Oh, I'm not too sure. I've never had a crush on anyone before, but I'm assuming you would think about them a lot, and you'd want to spend time with them. When you see them it probably feels different than seeing everyone else? Yaoyorozu offered uncertainly, looking like she desperately wanted to ask why Todoroki was suddenly curious about this, but was resisting. Todoroki twitched at the word, crush, but, sheet. Todoroki mumbled as he realized he did indeed think about Bakugu. Lot more than he should. And he did want to spend time with him and get to know him, that's why he reached out and asked to be friends. And yeah, Whenever he saw that telltale spiky mess of blonde hair, it certainly didn't feel the same as when he would see Midoriya or any of his friends. Yaoyorozu paused, staring at his expression wide-eyed. "Shuto, you do like someone, don't you?" Yaoyorozu asked a little quieter, and Todoroki bit the inside of his cheek, letting his gaze drift away. "I'm figuring it out," Todoroki muttered, kicking aimlessly at the ground. Yaoyorozu looked positively floored, but she didn't push it, leaning back against the wall again. "It's okay, you don't have to tell me unless you want to." Yaoyorozu spoke reassuringly, and Todoroki shot her a grateful smile. He would tell her, eventually, just not now. Yaoyorozu seemed to understand that, as she returned the smile and spoke again. "In any case, I can't imagine you having a crush on anyone. It's not really part of your image, is it?" Todoroki raised an eyebrow. "His image? What was his image even? Is that a bad thing?" "No, of course not. I'm just wondering how sweet and lovely whoever it is must be to have caught your eye." Yaoyorozu sighed, sounding a little in awe, and Todoroki dryly wondered for the briefest moment exactly how she saw him, before he violently choked on his milk tea. "Shuto!" Yaoyorozu turned to him in concern, and Todoroki just wiped his mouth and waved his hand, trying to suppress his coughing. Sweet and lovely? Bakugo couldn't be further if he tried. Todoroki was pretty socially inept, and blunt in a way that sometimes came off as awkward, sometimes arrogant. But he wasn't by any means shy, so when he saw his crush, it was still strange to use that word, peacefully lying on a grassy bank by the classroom, arms folded behind his head, he walked up to him and sat himself down beside him. Needless to say, Bakugo wasn't very peaceful anymore after that. He opened one baleful red eye into a slit as if Todoroki's mere presence had offended him, and that scowl stretched his lips as always. "Are you effing lost?" Bakugo growled irritably, and Todoroki decided to ignore the clear "PS's off." "No. I deliberately chose to sit here." Todoroki replied as monotonously as he could manage, knowing it'd PSS the guy off more. What could he say? It was just fun to purposefully get on Bakugo's nerves. And he was one of the only people who were brave enough to. "Huh? You looking for a fight, icy hot?" Bakugo curved his fingers and let off a few warning blasts in his open palm. It was so typical Todoroki found himself smothering a smile. "That'd be you." "Huh." So eloquent. Todoroki wondered why Bakugo sometimes chose to speak exclusively with various grunts and swear words like a typical brainless brute, when he knew the guy was sharp and brilliant, practically a genius. Todoroki merely shrugged, straightening his fingers in Bakugo's direction and casually freezing the budding explosion in the center of Bakugo's hand. "What the F dash, you can do that?" Bakugo almost screeched after a dumbstruck second of staring at the frozen sphere of light that hovered over his palm, before dissipating and falling back onto his hand in little frozen droplets of nitroglycerin. Todoroki savored the shocked, if infuriated expression on his face. It wasn't often that he could catch Bakugo off guard with his quirk nowadays, seeing as they sparred together so often. "Only because your hand is nearby, and you're not focused." Todoroki shrugged again, and Bakugo looked speechless. It was an unexpected victory that Todoroki was practically singing over, but he restrained himself just to a small, smug smile. Bakugo continued staring at him, mouth ajar, red eyes wide and searching, and Todoroki had to consciously cool his face down with his quirk. "Why you here anyway? Is there a reason you're sitting so close to me you can freeze my effing sweat?" Bakugo growled agitatedly, and Todoroki looked at the distance between them mildly. This could hardly be called close. There was about half a meter between them. Todoroki sat closer even to Uraraka. But then again, the radius of Bakugo's personal space bubble was on average 10 meters or so. "Because we're friends?" Todoroki tried for a calm, non-provocative tone, but of course Bakugo took it as a challenge anyway. "Who in the hell is your friend, Ice Prince?" Bakugo sneered, and Todoroki paused, trying not to show any sign of hurt. Did Bakugo forget what he'd said a couple of days ago? Sure, it was the most half-butted confirmation that they were in fact not enemies Todoroki could have received, but he would have thought it wasn't just a careless comment thrown out, Bakugo being as inclined to shun all other human beings as he was. We're friends is easier to say than we aren't not friends. Todoroki pointed out neutrally instead of second-guessing himself, subtly reminding Bakugo in case he really had forgotten. Or maybe that had just been Bakugo's instinctive response to the distasteful notion of friends. That was more likely. Bakugo tensed a little at that, and he didn't reply for a second. Whatever. You're so effing weird, just don't talk to me, alright? I can feel my IQ dropping. Bakugo grumbled and turned over onto his side to face away, head resting against the crook of his elbow. But he didn't tell Todoroki to go away. Todoroki smiled and entertained the thought of running his fingers through that spiky hair as he sat there beside Bakugo on the grassy bank quietly, letting him nap in peace. That night, Todoroki couldn't get to sleep. It was a pretty common occurrence, something he'd grown up used to dealing with, but the bouts of insomnia hadn't plagued him for a while now. It was around 3 a.m. but he decided to go downstairs and walk around a bit, instead of trying to force sleep to come. He paused as he got to the kitchen and saw the light was on. Oh, hey. Todoroki called quietly from the doorframe and Bakugo looked up from his cereal bowl like he'd been caught while committing a murder. His eyes rested on Todoroki and narrowed slightly before tension left his hunched-over frame. Todoroki was a simple guy, pleased by very small, simple things, such as Bakugo relaxing a little when he saw him. "Why are you down here at but o'clock in the morning?" Bakugo asked, and wow, apparently he did have an inside voice. It was nice and smooth. Todoroki took a seat at the other end of the short counter, feeling slanted eyes boring into him. "Why are you? Who eats cereal at 3 a.m.? Todoroki fired back with a small smile and Bakugo flipped him off, though he didn't shout at him like he might have during the day. "I do, shitface." Bakugo scowled and shoveled a spoonful into his mouth as if to prove a point. "Do you always?" Todoroki asked curiously, and Bakugo shot him a flat. "Why are you still breathing? Look. I get hungry a lot around this time, yeah? Because I eat and go to sleep early. What's it to you, Japanese flag?" Bakugo glared challengingly and Todoroki blinked in surprise, before accidentally letting a quiet laugh slip out. "Japanese flag? Because it was red and white?" That was a new one. His laugh must have irritated Bakugo, who turned his attention back to his cereal with an exponential increase in intensity. "Maybe you shouldn't eat and sleep so early then," Todoroki suggested mildly, and Bakugo barely spared him a glance. "Maybe you should go to hell." Todoroki couldn't help it, he laughed a little again, quickly bringing his fist up to his mouth to try to suppress the giggle. God, it was just so typical. And he liked it for some reason. He really did. Bakugo was staring at him like one might regard a dead insect, and he suddenly burst out, in much greater and Bakugo-esque volume, with, "The F's wrong with you? Other than my stupid empty face and my stupid split hair and my stupid brain-dead attitude?" Todoroki was almost grinning as he spoke, quoting the things Bakugo had insulted him about before. His response seemed to fuel the exasperation, disbelief and annoyance clashing in Bakugo's contorted expression. "Why don't you get set off when I talk shit to your dumbass face? Why do you find it funny, and not in the way Mina and Kaminari and Sheet do?" Bakugo sounded nothing short of mystified, and maybe a little horrified, which just amused him all the more. Todoroki just smiled at him, and Bakugo seemed to glitch a little, a million expressions jerking across his face before he settled on the usual put-upon irritation, face a little red from frustration maybe? He groaned and dragged a large hand over his face as he muttered, seemingly to himself, "Jesus Christ, you're like Kirishima but on a whole new level of stupid." "Thank you," Todoroki replied, honestly feeling a little flattered, but the incredulous stare Bakugo gave him indicated that it probably wasn't intended as praise. Todoroki shrugged, explaining with a simple, "You like Kirishima, so." Bakugo sat there motionlessly for a few seconds as the implications of that sunk in. Then the cereal bowl exploded in his hands in a milky, flaky mess across the counter. "First of all, I don't like, and what the F, do you mean what, so it's a compliment to you if I liked you? Don't just say weird but shit like that, God, why can't you just be normal for a few goddamn seconds dash?" Bakugo hollered at full volume as usual, half rising out of his chair as he practically hissed and spat in outrage. Todoroki frowned as he glanced at the mess of the cereal bowl, and was about to tell Bakugo to keep it down when there was a loud groan echoing from upstairs. Please, for the love of God, shut up when we're trying to sleep. It sounded like Kaminari's desperate cry cracking with sleep, and Bakugo responded, as expected, with an aggressive shout. Eat my fucking butt, Sparky. Gross. Came Ishido's muffled voice, and Todoroki rested his face in his hand for a moment, silently apologizing to his classmates for instigating the disruption to everyone's peaceful night. Bakugo was just so effing loud. Bakugo blew air out of flared nostrils like an enraged horse, and sat himself back down in his chair with a thump. Then, like nothing had happened, he narrowed his eyes at Todoroki contemplatively. Okay, say I actually like shitty hair. Which isn't effing true because he has molasses for brains, but you sounded awfully happy to be compared to him because of that. Why do you want me to like you? Bakugo asked bluntly, so bluntly Todoroki almost felt winded, and he wondered if this was what other people felt when Todoroki spoke his mind. And Jesus, yelling aside, Bakugo was just so sharp. Todoroki stared at him silently for a few moments, feeling pinned to the spot with those piercing red eyes. The milk's dripping onto your pants. Was not what Todoroki meant to say, but it gave him a few seconds of Bakugo looking down and cursing to steel himself to reply to his question. Of course I want you to like me. Because we're friends. A beat of complete silence passed. Todoroki fidgeted a little, unable to bite back a quiet, much less certain, aren't we? Bakugo stared at him for a few more wordless moments, though his expression looked infinitely calmer. Then he sighed, running a hand through his unruly hair. Look, I didn't think it'd f you up like this, but I probably should have been, I dunno, clearer, or nicer about it before, and today as well, or some shit. I don't fing know. My bad, okay? We are friends, alright? So stop looking at me with that stupid kicked puppy face. Bakugo grumbled impatiently, swatting at the air like Todoroki brought upon him the same irritation a buzzing fly might. Todoroki, on the other hand, was over the moon. Ah, I see. Todoroki replied softly, unable to push down a small smile. Bakugo made a strangled noise and punched the table, cheeks a little pinker than usual. Stop that face too. Bakugo demanded unreasonably, and Todoroki couldn't help but snort. Then what do you want me to do with my face? Blank isn't okay, supposedly kicked isn't okay, smiling isn't okay, Todoroki replied dryly, a little teasingly, and Bakugo sneered at him again, all bared teeth and pointy eyes, and yet Todoroki felt his heart thump. Well, fix your ugly mug then. Bakugo spoke with probably the most condescending tone he could saddle his voice with, and Todoroki raised his eyebrows, taking no offense. I don't want to hear you of all people telling me to fix my face. Your default expression makes children cry. Todoroki pointed out, which, while being a jab, was also 100% true. F you. Bakugo replied with no real heat behind it, even flashing Todoroki a lazy smirk. Was he proud of it? Wasn't a stretch to imagine. Todoroki internally rolled his eyes and got up to start carefully picking up the broken shards of the ceramic bowl. Are you doing healthy? Keep your pristine young master hands to yourself. I don't need you to clean up my mess. Bakugo growled unnecessarily as he swiped a piece away from Todoroki's reach. It reminded Todoroki exactly why Bakugo was so very difficult and hard to like, as he bit his tongue to stop himself from replying with, I'm just helping like any other person would. Helping was probably the greatest insult one could give Bakugo. But if he couldn't handle Bakugo grouching over normal, inoffensive things, how could he possibly hope to survive being his friend? I don't want anyone accidentally cutting themselves on these, so I'm clearing it away. Todoroki replied with his flattest deadpan voice, and Bakugo just scoffed in disbelief but turned his attention to cleaning up the mess. Ever the fucking hero. Bakugo muttered, then paused as he seemed to realize what he said, and Todoroki laughed. He was laughing a lot around Bakugo, he realized. I sure DMN hope so. Todoroki replied blithely and Bakugo snorted, but when Todoroki snuck a look at him, his lips were twitching upwards. It filled Todoroki's chest with something warm. They cleaned up in silence for a while, Todoroki stepping outside to safely deposit the broken shards into the bin as Bakugo wiped the milk and cereal off the counter and floor. Todoroki paused as he came back to the counter to see it positively sparkling under the kitchen lights. Ah yeah, it came as no surprise that Bakugo's strive for perfection in everything extended to mundane chores like cleaning as well. Still fascinating. Oi, Todoroki. Why you so obsessed with being my friend anyway? What's with the sudden interest in me, Ice Prince? Thought you were marginally less idiotic than Kirishima and the others. Bakugo suddenly spoke, voice much smoother and calmer than usual. It was more thoughtful than anything else, and Todoroki stared up at him in surprise at the lack of any challenge in his tone. He was a little distracted by the intent look in Bakugo's eyes that would only appear when he was giving something 100% of his attention and focus. There were so many reasons, so much Todoroki could probably bore Bakugo to death with, but he just offered a resigned laugh, shrugging. Because you're so unapologetically you. I like it. Bakugo stared at him with a strange look on his face, something open and miles more relaxed than his standard scowl, yet completely unreadable. Todoroki just stared back impassively, and Bakugo laughed, this low, barely audible sound. You know, I've been praised my whole life. For my quirk, my talents, my brain, my body even. And still, that's the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. Bakugo grinned, and it was still more of a sharp smirk than a genuine smile, but it was the least evil grin Todoroki had ever seen on his face. He felt his breath stutter. Bakugo snorted at Todoroki's expression, turning to walk towards the stairs. You're a real dumbass. Night, Frosty. And Todoroki went back to bed with a smile on his face, disproportionately happy for someone that just got called a dumbass. He'd never have imagined interacting with Bakugo would be anything close to positive, let alone leave him feeling a little floaty and dazed as he was, in a nice warm, drowsy way. Then all signs of drowsiness and hopes for a good night's sleep were unceremoniously shoved aside as he suddenly realized that Bakugo had called him by his actual name for the first time tonight. Todoroki felt like he'd finally actively gone and done something right in his life, as since that night, Bakugo had started being nice to him in Bakugo's own way. It wasn't anything big or special, barely even noticeable to an outsider, but Todoroki was equally bewildered and happy at the subtle differences in Bakugo's treatment of and attitude towards him. Overall it was just softer. When they bumped into each other, Bakugo would greet him with, "Hey," and some casual, mild insult, rather than the "F you lookin' at half-butted popsicle," which was already nothing short of a miracle. He didn't swear in most sentences anymore, and what was more bizarre was that there were a lot of sentences now. He actually talked to Todoroki now. Well, generally Todoroki would initiate conversation, but Bakugo would actually respond and carry on the conversation like a normal person, rather than immediately tell him to go die and leave his sight as quickly as possible. He let Todoroki sit beside him while he was napping in the shade beside the classrooms without any argument now, and didn't question it when Todoroki would occasionally walk beside him to class, or to the cafeteria, or back to the dorms. He scowled much less when it was them alone, talking late at night when Todoroki couldn't sleep and Bakugo got hungry. Or in the library when they were studying together. In silence after Bakugo firmly told Zero and the rest to the F off, I'll tutor your empty excuses for brains later, or sitting on the couch with Shuji and Koda in the communal area of the dorms while everyone else was playing games. Bakugo's neutral frown resting on his face for so long was still quite a jarring sight to see, and Todoroki had caught himself staring at those unusually calm features in a daze far more often than he'd admit. He was convinced he was right, now, and it wasn't just his eyes playing tricks on him. Bakugo was pretty. Todoroki liked to think Bakugo's voice had changed a little as well when talking to him. It was a little quieter, much more like a normal person's inside voice, and a bit smoother too, lacking that biting edge his crude words were so well known for. Todoroki was glad to find that Bakugo's almost overwhelming competitive spirit and sense of rivalry hadn't diminished in the slightest, though. He'd still spar with Todoroki with everything he had, pushing himself to the very limits of his power with that crazed grin on his face, fighting like a blaze of wildfire. Oh, and the pregame, mid-battle and recovery trash talk still remained, riling up Todoroki's own sense of competition and challenge as always. But he would sneer down at Todoroki's abilities less now. Their relationship hadn't changed much when in the presence of other people, though. Todoroki didn't think there was a particular reason, they just belonged to different friend circles after all, which didn't interact too much in general. So he was very surprised when Kirishima suddenly pulled him off to the side one day, eyes gleaming in that pure, straightforward, Kirishima-typical excitement. "Yo Todoroki, what's your secret, man?" Kirishima grinned as if he actually expected Todoroki to know what he was talking about. Todoroki blinked, doing his best not to make his usual deadened expression too off-putting as he tried to figure out the context. Kirishima was a cool guy, cheerful, very down-to-earth, and pretty strong. He reminded Todoroki of a big puppy in some ways, that was always happy to see you and would tolerate all of your bullshit, but in such an unconditionally loving and supportive way that he made you feel bad for being in but. Todoroki could definitely see how Kirishima had marched his way into Bakugu's thorn wall of a heart. Kirishima somehow just made Todoroki want to be friendly to him, and it was a natural quality about him that he'd been quietly in awe over for quite some time. He often wondered what it'd be like being friends with the guy. But coming back to the present, Todoroki had no clue what Kirishima was talking about. Todoroki replied intelligently, and Kirishima flashed an even wider grin as he slung an arm comfortably around Todoroki's shoulders. Todoroki twitched in surprise at the sudden overly friendly contact, but decided he didn't really mind. "I'm talking about Bakugu, dude. How'd you tame him? He's so nice to you. He must like you a lot." Kirishima exclaimed with so much genuine excitement and positivity Todoroki felt a little overwhelmed. He hadn't even known Kirishima had realized he and Bakugu were closer now. Todoroki paused, quickly having to cool his cheeks down with his quirk as Kirishima's words registered. Bakugu's best friend, arguably the person that knew him the best, thought Bakugu liked him a lot? Maybe it's just 'cause you're not annoying to him like the rest of us. It's not too surprising he's always respected you because you're strong as hell. But why suddenly? Did you say something? Help a guy out here, I want to learn how to start avoiding bodily harm around him too. Kirishima grinned brightly and Todoroki felt like he had to hold up a hand to call for time out. Too many things were being shoved onto him at once. He wasn't annoying to Bakugu? There was such thing as a person existing that didn't annoy Bakugu? Asides from maybe All Might, but that was still a distant goal to pursue. Bakugu had always respected him? The Bakugu who'd gone out of his way to call people he didn't know extras, and let them know he only thought of them as nameless stepping stones? Todoroki sounded a little faint to himself, though he doubted many other people would be able to pick it up. Kirishima just stared curiously at him and Todoroki dipped his head and laughed a little helplessly, a short, quiet sound. "He doesn't hit you, Kirishima. He's nice to you as well." Todoroki pointed out with a small smile and Kirishima conceded that point with a smaller smile of his own, eyes softening a little. "Yeah. I know old Blasty's got a heart in there somewhere. Taken me ages to graduate from dumbass to Kirishima. Well, he still likes calling me shitty hair every now and then. Oh, but now that I think about it, he calls you by your name a lot too now, doesn't he? It's pretty amazing." Kirishima whistled, and Todoroki shrugged, as if his heart didn't skip a beat every time he heard Todoroki spat out gruffly like Bakugu was making up for the lack of insult with the distasteful tone of his voice. "All I did was ask him to be friends. He yelled at me for that, but then said we're not friends. And then later confirmed that we are actually friends, and called me dumb. And now he tolerates my presence." Todoroki explained offhandedly, but Kirishima stared at him in awe as if he just told him Bakugu had gotten down on one knee for him. "He verbally said you were friends? Ah man, even Denki, Siro and Ishido have never heard him admit to being their friend. And I had to basically pull the words out of his mouth this one time he was super out of it after staying up all night studying." Kirishima was staring at Todoroki with visible newfound respect, and Todoroki suppressed a laugh. Something warm settled in his chest at hearing that, and he couldn't help but smile a little, gazing down at the floor. Todoroki started a little hesitantly, but Kirishima's bright, open stare and that warm, happy feeling drove him to speak his mind. I like Bakugo. HM? He's got an awful personality sometimes, but he's pretty great, isn't he? He's got so much ambition and confidence and insane strength that you can't help but admire him. Kirishima nodded firmly, a half-fond, half-reverent tone to his voice as he folded his arms over his chest. Todoroki glanced at him and away again, kicking aimlessly at the floor once. No, I mean, like him. Todoroki spoke steadily, but refused to make eye contact. Kirishima didn't respond immediately, but Todoroki could see him stiffen in a way that had nothing to do with his quirk. Todoroki continued to stare straight ahead at nothing, a little embarrassed. It was one thing admitting it to Midoriya, but Kirishima, whom he'd spoken to only a handful of times before. He doubted Kirishima would be mean about it, but still. Kirishima paused, seeming to be floundering for words, eyes big and round, and Todoroki looked up at him, glad for once that he had a naturally blank face and a deadpan voice. God help him if he actually showed his embarrassment. Even in saying that, he could feel his cheeks warm up despite his instinctive body temperature control. I've thought about what his lips feel like way too much. Todoroki replied flatly, probably unnecessarily honest with that statement, but bluntness was a prominent part of his nature after all. Kirishima had a funny look on his face, like he'd swallowed something down the wrong pipe, and Todoroki immediately regretted saying it. He looked away again as casually as he could manage, though he could definitely feel his face heating up some more. My bad. You don't have to say anything, I just thought I'd tell you, because you're close with him and all. Oh nah man, don't get shy on me now. Admitting that you have feelings for someone is manly as hell. Kirishima rested a heavy hand on his shoulder and gave him a thumbs up. Todoroki relaxed a little as he saw the excitement and lack of any judgment in Kirishima's clear, supportive gaze. I like him. And I don't know what to do about it because Bakugo's not exactly the romantic, hand-holding type. Todoroki muttered wryly and Kirishima offered a sympathetic smile at that. You sure got that right. Oh, and for the record, his lips are chapped as all hell. Once we all passed out in Siro's room and his face was on my knee, so. Kirishima chirped, making Todoroki snort. Unsurprising. But in any case, wow. You like Bakugo. Someone actually likes Bakugo, and it's you of all people. That's poetic, dude. Kirishima's voice was filled with wonder, and Todoroki blinked. Me of all people? Todoroki echoed, not sure if he should be offended or not. Not in a bad way, of course. You're like the coolest guy I know, no pun intended. Which is why it's already unexpected to think that you like anyone in our class, and it happens to be Bakugo. Kirishima explained with a somewhat sheepish grin, and Todoroki snorted again. Trust me, I didn't expect it either. I'm super happy you're comfortable telling me, by the way. Don't worry, I won't tell anyone about it, not even Denki. It's a promise between men. Kirishima grinned and hit his own chest with his fist. Todoroki let out a silent breath of relief that Kirishima had picked up on that without him needing to ask. Yeah, I don't really want it to be publicized. And also Bakugo would probably murder me first than everyone else in the class if it spread around. Todoroki replied dryly, not really wanting to imagine that guaranteed massacre. Kirishima sighed, shrugging in a what-can-you-do way. Yeah, no kidding. Man, he's such a handful. You got some strange tastes, dude. Kirishima laughed at him, but it wasn't unkind. Todoroki hid a smile. Says the guy that stuck to him 24/7 till he gave in and allowed another human into his life. Todoroki kept his rebuttal light, and Kirishima just flashed him a, literally, sharp grin. So, what's the situation between you two right now? You're friends, but not that close yet, right? You want me to help in any way? Kirishima offered brightly, and Todoroki immediately waved his hand. Oh, no, you don't have to go out of your way, Thush. Nah man, it's cool. I'll just get our group to come sit with you guys at lunch sometimes or something. Not all the time, don't worry, and I don't think Midoriya and them would mind. And I doubt you need much help at all since you're like, ranked #1 in our school by the girls, but it might just give you guys more chances to talk, since Bakugu's antisocial as F-. He acts like he hates it, but he does open up more around us. Kirishima winked and Todoroki blinked, words stumbling on the tip of his tongue. Kirishima was such a good guy. Also, ranked #1 in the school by the girls? Maybe it was little mean, but Todoroki thought those girls should probably get out more. Fuyumi had compared his personality to wet cardboard before. Oh, that sounds good then, yeah. Thank you. Todoroki smiled, hating that he couldn't make himself sound more sincere, since he really was thankful, but Kirishima seemed to get it anyway. You don't have to thank me for anything, man. Go on, go tame the Baku beast for us all. Kirishima slapped Todoroki's shoulder good-naturedly, and Todoroki couldn't help but begin to laugh a little, when there was an all-too-familiar growl behind them. Go do what to who now? Bakugu's voice trembling with fraying edges of restraint was just about the most threatening Todoroki had ever heard it, and Kirishima glanced at Todoroki, uttering a pleasant F-. Todoroki stepped back a little at the ensuing attempt at cold-blooded murder, marveling at how Kirishima didn't get a scratch on his quirk-hardened body from Bakugu's violent explosions. He prepared to bring up a wall of ice to defend himself, but Bakugu didn't try to kill him even once in his burst of rage. It was almost unsettling. A few moments later, as Kirishima lay on the floor in a winded but thankfully alive heap, Bakugu turned his scowl onto Todoroki, who steeled himself for questions. And probably a trip to the intensive care unit of a hospital if he slipped up. But Bakugu just stomped past him, and Todoroki guessed that meant the only thing he'd heard was Kirishima's last comment out of context. Oi, you coming or what? Class is gonna start, Elsa. Bakugu threw the irritated words over his shoulder, and Todoroki blinked, looking back at Kirishima in concern, wondering if he should offer some help. Kirishima just raised a shaky thumbs up, looking comically similar to Kaminari in idiot mode. He suppressed a smile and turned to follow Bakugu. Since when were you all buddy-buddy with Kirishima? Bakugu slid him a narrow-eyed, almost sulky look as they walked towards their classroom, which Todoroki was beginning to recognize as an angry cover-up for curiosity. He's a good guy. Really good for you. Todoroki couldn't keep the little smirk off his face, and Bakugu, predictably, blew up. Huh? The F is that supposed to mean half-butted F-? Bakugu yelled in his face, tensed fingers looking more like talons as he detonated a series of small bursts in his palms. Todoroki just rolled his eyes. Don't take everything I say as a challenge, Bakugu. I just mean he's a good friend. But especially for you. Like a kindergarten teacher with all the patience in the world is, to a bratty toddler. Todoroki continued with his usual flat expression, knowing Bakugu knew he was doing it on purpose, and inwardly snickering at the veins sticking out in his temples. But instead of yelling at him some more, Bakugu just let out an irritated growl and shoved his hands back in his pockets, scowling at Todoroki's faked innocent face. You're a real but you know that? Bakugu griped, but there was no bite to it, and Todoroki just shrugged, not denying it. It means the world to me, hearing that from Todoroki drawled in monotone, and Bakugu laughed. It was a short burst of laughter and quite loud, like he'd been caught off guard. But that unguarded second was enough to make Todoroki jolt and almost trip over himself. And they say you don't have a sense of humor, I see. Annoying little sheet. Bakugu smirked, voice rough and aggressive as always, but for Bakugu's standards it was almost fond. Todoroki felt his heart stop for a beat, as cliché as it was. His feet stopped as well, involuntarily, and it took Bakugu a few steps before he realized Todoroki had fallen back a little. He turned back to raise an eyebrow at Todoroki, and his eyes widened, mouth falling slightly open with a weird, jittery movement. What the F? Stop smiling creepily at me, fuck off, go to hell, die. Bakugu hissed in one breath, punctuating the sentence with an explosion in his palm. Todoroki quickly straightened out his expression, trying his best not to let his lips twitch as he noticed the tiny gleam of panic in Bakugu's angry eyes that he was starting to identify as not necessarily a negative thing. Why is your default response to everything die? Todoroki let his flat eyes flick over to Bakugo mildly, eyebrows slightly raised. He'd found that set Bakugo off more than rolling his eyes. Bakugo turned and kept walking as Todoroki caught up to him again, throwing out a loud "Tease" with feeling. "Don't ask stupid questions, stupid." Bakugo scowled predictably, and Todoroki couldn't help but smile again, ducking his head down in an effort to hide it. Bakugo made a frustrated noise. "What?" "Nothing. I'm just happy." Todoroki murmured softly, feeling Bakugo's incredulous stare boring into the side of his head. "It was nice." Bakugo cursed under his breath, something Todoroki didn't even know he was capable of doing, and he looked up at him curiously. Bakugo met his stare and quickly glanced away, running an agitated hand through his hair. His face was red, and his words came out as a mumble. "If. You're weird, Todoroki." True to his word, Kirishima brought his group over for lunch the next day. Todoroki had honestly forgotten about it, sitting down with Uraraka and waiting for Ida and Midoriya to get their food and come, when Kirishima called out to them. "Yo, Todoroki, Uraraka. Mind if we sit with you guys today?" Kirishima walked up to them with a bright grin and Uraraka glanced at Todoroki in surprise. Todoroki said nothing, leaving it up to Kirishima to not make this weird. Shiro, Kaminari, Ashido and, clearly reluctantly dragged over, Bakugo didn't seem bothered by this not-so-usual occurrence, but then again Class 3, as Baku Squad was always spontaneous and, most of them, easygoing after all. "Oh yeah, of course we don't mind. Mina, what's up?" Uraraka looked to Ashido for an explanation curiously as she shifted over to make room, and Todoroki did the same, trying not to look like he noticed when Kirishima casually pushed Bakugo down to sit beside him. It was pretty unnecessary, this whole thing, and he did his best not to let dry amusement slip onto his face. But at the same time it felt sort of nice having someone help him. Even if he didn't need it. I dunno, Kirishima just suggested we sit with some other people today. I think it's great, the more the merrier as they say. Ashido replied sunnily and the group sat themselves down comfortably. Their class had always been pretty close with each other even if there were distinct groups, so it wasn't awkward as they chattered away. Todoroki took a glance at Bakugo viciously and fruitlessly, stabbing his rice with chopsticks and snorted, eating his own food in silence and letting Bakugo vent whatever stress was bothering him now onto his rice. It was nice just having him sit there, really. Then Midoriya and Ida arrived and Bakugo's head snapped up like he'd scented prey. "Hold up, no one said I had to eat with Ifan Deku." Bakugo growled immediately and Midoriya flinched, stiff smile twitching on his face in that visibly on-edge way. "Oh hey you guys. Hey Kaken." Midoriya greeted awkwardly, sending Todoroki a lightning-fast glance. Todoroki offered his sympathies with a slightly warmer than usual blank stare, and Midoriya bit his lip. Midoriya and Bakugo weren't on actual bad terms anymore, they'd more or less come to an understanding a while ago when they'd had a rumored, long-overdue confrontation. He knew Midoriya didn't mind being around Bakugo, but Bakugo still treated him the same, like his responses were on autopilot out of familiarity. So on the surface, everything was the same as in their first year, minus the genuine fear from Midoriya's side. But this situation was somewhat Todoroki's fault, so he spoke up quietly, glad the rest of the group were still chatting and not paying him any attention. "Don't cause a scene, Bakugo. We're just having lunch, he's not doing anything to you. Try be nice for once, who knows, you might like it." Todoroki drawled the last bit, calmly eating his food as he knew his apparent indifference would get more of a rise out of him. Bakugo shot up from his seat and sparked a rapid-fire series of warning blasts in his palms. "Oh, since when were you my mother, Halfie?" Bakugo growled through gritted teeth, lips stretched back in that usual threatening smirk snarl. He opened his mouth to issue some sort of challenge as always, probably, and Todoroki just picked up a large piece of steamed potato with his chopsticks and roughly jammed it into his mouth to shut him up. "What the F?" Todoroki ignored Bakugo's indignant screech as he choked on potato to gesture to Midoriya. "Sit down while he's distracted." Todoroki spoke as if he was talking about a rabid wild animal, purposefully loud enough for Bakugo to hear. Midoriya stifled a giggle behind his hand and sat down with Ida, who, bless his good, kind soul, asked Bakugo if he was all right with genuine concern. Bakugo just hissed and spat incoherently at him. "You find it funny, shitty nerd?" Bakugo snarled, banging his fist, sparking with the beginnings of explosions, down on the table, and Todoroki thought both the table and Midoriya didn't deserve the destruction that was sure to come. He tugged at Bakugo's sleeve to pull his hand off the table and stared back calmly at the blazing eyes that snapped over to him. "Can you be a little nicer to Midoriya?" Todoroki asked very, very quietly so not to draw attention from others, wanting to keep it discreet and low-key seeing as it was still somewhat a sensitive subject. Bakugo, however, was the living antithesis of discreet and low-key. "Ah, your head broken, iceberg? Why in the ever-loving F would I be nicer to Deku?" Bakugo spat unnecessarily viciously, and Midoriya was frantically waving his hands at Todoroki as if to tell him to drop it, but this had been weighing on Todoroki's mind for a while now. He wasn't scared of confronting Bakugo about his shittier qualities. He very nearly wasn't able to hold back his instinctive response of, "Because you're better than this and you should really graduate from your complete garbage person status by now." But he didn't want to have this conversation, which would surely escalate, in front of everyone. Instead, he went with a calm, "Because he's my friend? I don't like you being mean to him." Which was also true. "That doesn't mean jack's hit to me." Bakugo sneered coldly, ripping his arm away from Todoroki's grip on his sleeve. Todoroki paused. Well, he wasn't presumptuous enough to think Bakugo cared about his opinions just because they were a little closer now, but hearing him say it straight out like that, it still stung a little. He blinked, fingers twitching. The silence was getting a little bit longer than was natural and he was trying to figure out what to say to pass this off, but Bakugo gave a frustrated growl, the conflicted scowl on his face almost looking as if he regretted saying it. Fine, I got it, I'll just ignore his FANG existence, alright? Don't look at me like that. Bakugo grumbled and slumped back in his seat, lip curled in ever-present irritation. But he subtly nudged Todoroki's arm with the back of his hand, and Todoroki recognized the awkward, jerky movement as a clumsy apology. Todoroki almost cooed and melted at his feet at the endearing gesture. How many people on this planet could say they'd received an apology from Bakugo Katsuki? And this was the second time as well. And both times had been because he'd noticed his words made Todoroki a little upset. He couldn't resist a small, soft smile. Scratch that, don't look at me in general. This FNG pattern is getting familiar, Halfie. Bakugo growled with clear warning ringing in his tone, but Todoroki couldn't help but smile a little wider at the slight spot of color in his cheeks. Midoriya, Ida, and Uraraka focused on their food with overly intense concentration, and the Baku squad minus Bakugo exchanged glances with eyes that gleamed like they'd accidentally stumbled upon some unexpected treasure, but no one said a word. Bakugo had pretty much invited himself into Todoroki's room to study, claiming that his group wouldn't shut up or leave his, and the library was too far. Todoroki didn't mind, of course, but he'd had to consciously stop himself from teasing him by saying, "If you wanted to study with me, you could just say so." As fun as messing with Bakugo was, he'd found that pushing too far, and making him embarrassed about wanting to spend time with him in particular would make the guy back away immediately, not without an explosive, condescending stream of curses to him and his family, of course, and make him seemingly wary of interacting with Todoroki for the next day or so. He really was like a wild animal, one that Todoroki had to be careful not to corner or pressure, in order to win his trust. Of course, Todoroki never pointed that out to anyone. Even Bakugo had his vulnerable parts, and he knew his pride would never be able to take it if Todoroki poked at it. So he just let him inside without a word, and snorted when Bakugo did a double take and stared at his very traditional Japanese room in the same exact way his other classmates had in their first year. It made him wonder what Bakugo's room looked like. Because of the Room King competition, when they'd first moved into the dorms, Todoroki knew what everyone's rooms looked like except Bakugo and Ajui's. And he'd never had a reason to go to either of their rooms before, so it still remained a mystery to him. They'd already studied together before, and Todoroki had been taken aback at how seriously Bakugo took it. Well, he hadn't expected any half-butted effort seeing as this was Bakugo, who put his all and then some into everything he did to try and be the best at it. But he was a consistent top spot contender in the class in terms of academics, scoring even higher than Todoroki for 3 years in a row. Todoroki didn't necessarily think of himself as outstandingly smart, but he relied not only on the brute strength of his quirk in battle, but his intelligence to strategize and be able to utilize his quirk to its best effect, which he objectively knew in itself was formidable. And so, he'd always kind of just assumed Bakugo was just naturally impressively smart and good at everything. He was sharp and quick-witted, that was true, but in terms of academics, Todoroki only realized after seeing him study that the most likely reason for his consistent top grades was because of the insane amount of effort he put into learning everything he possibly could. He'd seen it before already, but it was still fascinating. See the loud, literally explosive delinquent sit there barely moving, 110% focused in his studies. And so Todoroki was a little distracted, his pen having gone loose in his grip for a while now as he just stared in silence at Bakugo studying. It didn't slip Bakugo's notice apparently, although Todoroki couldn't tell when he'd realized, seeing as he didn't so much as twitch away from his books. "You got something to say? Quit staring at me and concentrate on your own sheet. Or go do something else." Bakugo suddenly spoke up, voice as rough and challenging as always, but it was quiet. He didn't look up as he turned a page and Todoroki cleared his throat a little awkwardly, flicking his pen around his fingers. "My bad," Todoroki muttered, switching his attention back to the book in front of him and trying to read it for a good few seconds before realizing it was upside down somehow. He cleared his throat again and quickly turned it the right way up. Bakugo glanced up then and gave him a flat look. Distracted. "Is watching me study really that interesting, Frosty?" Bakugo raised a judgmental eyebrow and Todoroki cleared his throat, so tempted to tell him that he was pretty when he was focused. That he was pretty all the time. "You study so hard. It is interesting," Todoroki said instead, which wasn't a lie. Bakugo's eyebrow arched higher and that usual scowl stretched his lips again. "Not everyone's a natural-born genius like you, some of us gotta work for it." Bakugo grouched, somehow managing to make the compliment sound like an insult. Todoroki blinked, taken aback anyway. "That I'm not a genius," Todoroki replied slowly and Bakugo scoffed, eye twitching with what looked like impatience. "Yeah, sure, you might not be on the same crazy level as the class presidents, but you're naturally smart, okay? Everyone knows that. You don't have to do anything and you're already head and shoulders above other people. It gets on my DMN nerves." Bakugo drawled with equal parts of genuine annoyance and dry resignation. Todoroki couldn't reply for a moment, still unsure whether to feel insulted or praised. "I do work hard on my studies, you know. Just not as hard as you do," Todoroki pointed out in a carefully neutral tone, not wanting to start a fight just yet. Bakugo huffed. "Yeah, you better not. If you worked as hard as I do you'd beat me in the next exams for sure, since you've got the brains for it." Bakugo threw the words out carelessly, but Todoroki was floored. Bakugo just verbally suggested he could be beaten? He'd actually acknowledged the possibility? It was just academics, nowhere near as important to either of them as their hero studies, but still. It didn't give him a sense of pride or superiority, seeing as Todoroki didn't share that view, and even if he did he wouldn't care about it. But it did make him feel warm, hearing Bakugo say it of his own accord. He knew no one else in their class had ever heard Bakugo admit to or accept the fact that he couldn't win some things. That he allowed himself to say something that went so against his very nature to Todoroki. Todoroki smiled softly. "It's damn near impossible to work as hard as you do, Bakugo." "I know. I don't do anything in halves," Bakugo answered, his immediate response sounding unexpectedly more objective than cocky. Todoroki had to bite back a, "That's why I like you," from escaping past his lips. Bakugo regarded him with a strange expression, slanted eyes relaxed and thoughtful. "You work as hard as me when it comes to hero training though." "I do. Becoming the strongest hero I can be matters to me." Todoroki spoke both as confirmation and as a brief explanation, and Bakugo's lips twitched in amusement. Todoroki itched to take a picture. "And grades don't. Not so much that I'd put as much effort in. Do they matter to you?" Todoroki asked curiously and Bakugo shrugged, leaning back on his hands. No. Grades don't mean shit in the hero business, as long as they're decent you're fine. It's more of the good principle I guess. Like I said, I don't do anything in halves. Especially for something that's ranked. I can't stand not 100% seriously trying to take the top spot. Even though logically speaking I know I can't beat Yaoyorozu, I ain't accepting that till I've given my all in trying to crush her anyway. Call it pride or whatever. Bakugo drawled, glancing up at the ceiling with flat, but calm eyes. Todoroki swallowed, stomach feeling a little floaty. He wasn't sure why, maybe it was the continued calm, easy admission that Todoroki just knew even Kirishima would never be allowed to hear, because yeah, Bakugo had the most pride out of anyone he'd ever met. Or maybe it was the relatively smooth tone of his inside voice melting over his ears as usual. Or maybe it was Bakugo's words, reaffirming why Todoroki respected him so much. Todoroki was so head over heels it was stupid. Bakugo lowered his head and fixed Todoroki with an even flatter stare, surprisingly still lacking any fire behind it. Halfie, you gotta stop with the faces, come on. How am I meant to say anything without worrying about whether I just broke your dumbass brain? Bakugo sounded more exasperated than angry, but Todoroki could see the telltale twitch beneath his eye that gave away the fact that he was a little, dare he think it, flustered. Todoroki didn't bother to change his soft expression. I just think you're really admirable in that way. Maybe not the crushing people part, but wanting to win and doing everything you can in an honest effort to do so. I really like that part of you. Todoroki laughed a little, quietly at Bakugo's strangled expression. His cheeks were a little pink. What the hell? People usually hate that I'm so obsessive about winning, the F's wrong with you. I wasn't fishing for a compliment, alright? I try to win for me, not to impress anyone. Bakugo growled almost defensively, and Todoroki honestly didn't know why he was feeling defensive, since that was exactly his point. I know. That's why I like it. Todoroki spoke simply with a smile, to which Bakugo slapped a hand over his face and gave a long suffering groan. Someone get this idiot out of my face. Why are you always like this? Bakugo dragged his hand down his face with a pained mutter, and Todoroki just tilted his head. Like what? You just say these super embarrassing things without being embarrassed at all. You freak of nature. Bakugo grumbled, scowling at him like the sight of his face was an insult. His cheeks were steadily darkening. Todoroki blinked, not really sure he deserved to be called a freak of nature just because of that. But this was Bakugo after all. I only say the truth. I don't think it's embarrassing. Todoroki replied, though it quickly dawned on him that this was yet another one of his overly blunt moments. That's exactly what I mean. Bakugo squinted at him and Todoroki just stared at him for a moment. Then he ducked his head down and laughed, not sure what he found funny, but just enjoying and savoring that light, warm feeling in his chest that Bakugo was so good at causing without even trying. He propped his elbow up on his low table and rested his cheek against his palm, not bothering to hide the small smile that still danced on his lips. Alright, my bad. I'll keep quiet, go back to studying. Todoroki addressed his book nonchalantly as he flipped through to some more relevant pages and picked up his pen. He was aware of Bakugo's eyes still fixed on him after a while of actually studying, realizing that Bakugo hadn't moved an inch. He lifted his gaze questioningly, and Bakugo didn't even blink, staring at him with this look. Todoroki lifted his cheek from his palm and straightened a little, a bit confused. Bakugo! Bakugo seemed to snap out of some sort of daze, coughing loudly and grabbing his pen unnecessarily violently. Don't talk, Frosty, it's not good for my brain. Bakugo deadpanned, refusing to look at him, and Todoroki just stifled a laugh and nodded. Guys, breaking FANG news. Kaminari announced with a flourish, slamming his hand down on the table in the dorm living room. The group lounging around at 9 p.m. after a tough day of training consisted of Ishido, Azui, Satu, Jairu, Siro, Uraraka and Midoriya, and there were greatly varying levels of interest in the gazes directed Kaminari's way. Did you finally learn how to use your quirk? Did you finally get a girlfriend? Did you sort out the weird rash down there? You guys what Rashmina? Kaminari glared at Ishido, Siro and Jairu, to which Ishido just winked. Kaminari shook his head dramatically, flinging out a hand. No, it's much more monumental than any of us could imagine. I mean, you getting a girlfriend is already beyond the realms of imagination. I will punch your D-dash, Siro. No, I saw Bakugo smiling. As in a real, normal sane human smile, not his usual, I eat babies, smile. It was pretty fucking soft as well, I got goosebumps. Kaminari emphasized that with a full body shiver, and everyone stared at him for a motionless beat, again with varying levels of surprise on their faces. Bakugo can smile? You're not shitting us, right? Kaken did? Come on, tell us more, why was he smiling? What could possibly make Lord Explosion Murder smile of all things? Shuji passed the group discussing this mundane development with awestruck, hushed tones as if Bakugo smiling was the equivalent to someone becoming a serial killer overnight, and thought to himself, UA's budding heroes really needed to go find a hobby. I think we all can guess by this point the only person on Earth who can make Bakugo-chan smile, other than All Might. Azui pointed out helpfully, and everyone exchanged lightning-fast glances. Was he with Todoroki? Kaminari, come on, he was with Todoroki, right? Kaminari paused for effect, glancing around at his adoring audience solemnly, before nodding. Yes. Give us details, you sheet. At Ishido's war cry as she lunged herself at Kaminari and shook him by the collar, Kaminari explained, again with theatrical flair. It was something out of a teen romance movie. Believe me when I say I was disgusted and scarred for life. Kaminari gave a dramatic sigh as he pressed a hand to his chest. I was on my way back here when I saw them sitting beside each other on the grass. It was already dark, and Todoroki was talking quietly, while pointing at a star. And Bakugo just looked at him like he couldn't really focus on what Todoroki was saying, and smiled. Like, I'm talking motherfucking hard eyes. Never before has such a calm, soft expression appeared on Bakugo Katsuki's face, I'll tell you that. The ensuing shrieks and squeals were enough to rouse the sleeping lion upstairs, and Bakugo hollered down at them loud enough to shake the building. Shut the F up, berate trash, I'm trying to if you sleep. Oh, grow up, softy. Who the hell goes to bed at 8 o'clock anyway? Ishido yelled cheerfully back, and Midoriya looked fully ready to pass out in fear. Soft dash. The resounding boom of a violent explosion echoed its way down and Ishido screamed, half the group scrambling around with her to prepare to evacuate and run for their lives when another yell sounded upstairs. The F you want half and half be? It was comical, the way everyone immediately shut up and stopped in their tracks, eyes gleaming as they stared fixedly at the ceiling. They, expectedly, couldn't hear Todoroki's quiet response, and Bakugo just swore overly loudly again and slammed a door shut, but he didn't come down to commence a mass genocide. The looks on Ishido, Kaminari and Siro's faces were undeniably predatory, as they took in what just happened. So, Todoroki now has the power to calm the beast and shut him up. The grin on Kaminari's face was similar to the look he had whenever he and Mineta would get together and form the worst combo of perverted trash, at this new discovery. Siro and Ishido had scarily similar expressions. Blasty. F-I-N-G. Love. Siro looked just about ready to sing with glee, and Ishido was trembling from head to toe. Finally, she muttered, fists clenched before her. Finally, we have some heckin' romance in this class. Her grin was almost blinding, and Midoriya just sighed and smiled, looking up to the ceiling as his classmates excitedly discussed how often they'd see Bakugo and Todoroki together now, and how Bakugo had undeniably gotten calmer and safer since he started hanging out with Todoroki. Though Midoriya still had his instinctive worries for Todoroki's health. Not that the guy couldn't protect himself, it was just Bakugo was just a walking hazard by nature. He was ultimately happy for his friend. Isn't that great, Todoroki-kun? Midoriya must have accidentally summoned the guy down, as Todoroki appeared at the foot of the stairs, casually walking to the kitchen. Todoroki paused as he caught sight of his classmates staring at him with identical Cheshire cat grins. Except for Midoriya, who was sending him a weak, apologetic smile. What? Is something wrong? Is there something on my face? Todoroki asked blankly, and Kaminari shook his head, not changing his expression or even blinking for a second. Oh no, you're doing amazing, Todoroki. Keep up the good work, you savior of 3. There was something sinister about Kaminari's encouraging thumbs up, and Todoroki just stared at his frozen, grinning classmates for a few moments. Then he gave a small nod, beyond confused, continuing to the kitchen for a glass of milk with 8 pairs of eyes tracking his every move. Was it something he'd said today? What's your favorite food? Todoroki asked as he and Bakugo left the classroom at the end of school. Bakugo arched an eyebrow at him. What's this, 21 questions? You know, sometimes when people ask you harmless questions, you can assume they don't have ulterior motives and genuinely want to know, and just answer them like a normal person. Todoroki pointed out helpfully and tried not to smirk as he dodged an uncomfortably close explosion. I like eating anything spicy. Happy now, you obnoxious F-. Bakugo grinded out between clenched teeth, and Todoroki snorted. Jesus, that's so typical. Ah, as if you and your cold soba can talk, Mr. Traditional Japanese Ice Cube Room. Bakugo sneered mockingly, but Todoroki paused, raising an eyebrow. How do you know what my favorite food is? Because you and that windfucker were yelling about it. My apologies for not blocking my DMN ears. Bakugo growled irritably, and Todoroki took a long moment to process that. Windfucker. Yurashi from Shiketsu High? When did? Oh, back in their first year when they were at the provisional license courses? Then he'd completely forgotten about whatever the overwhelmingly energetic, enthusiastic guy had talked to him about, and Bakugo hadn't? Well, you actually listen. Todoroki didn't mean to say it out loud, but Bakugo's reaction was funny anyway. If you wanted me to beat your dumbass face in, you should have just said so, Halfie. Bakugo growled around a set-off, contorted smirk, veins ticking in his neck and temple as he released a flurry of blasts from his palms. Todoroki gracefully ignored him, humming in thought. Both of our favorite foods are so typical. Do you like sweets? Let's go to a dessert place instead. Todoroki suggested not unreasonably, he thought, but Bakugo looked at him as if he'd just asked him to go jump into a volcano. Instead, since when was I going anywhere with you, Candy Cane? And don't just assume I'm free, inconsiderate BSRD. Bakugo griped, and Todoroki just gave him a look. Are you not? Die. With that decided, Todoroki turned to head towards a dessert place nearby. Bakugo grumbled and groaned as usual, but he ended up following him anyway, making Todoroki hide a smug smirk. They both ordered drinks and sat down at a table by the window. It was almost like magic. The area around them immediately cleared as Bakugo stomped over to his seat, expression a storm. Todoroki wondered if he was mad at the place or the company, then decided it was a waste of time to ever try figure out why Bakugo was angry. Instead, he just started talking to him about nothing in particular, purposely pushing every single one of Bakugo's trigger-happy buttons and getting called every insulting name under the sun. So, a normal conversation between the two, really. The drinks took an awfully long time to come, a fact that Bakugo growled about every few seconds as if he was worried Todoroki would forget, but Todoroki found that he didn't mind at all. Honestly, just sitting here at a cozy little dessert place with Bakugo after school, just talking and bantering and watching those murderous glares lose a bit of fire one by one, in tiny, barely noticeable increments. Todoroki could hardly believe it, but it was comfortable. So comfortable. This must be what a high feels like. Their drinks did come, eventually, and Todoroki had to kick Bakugo's shin to distract him from growling irritably at the waiter, which earned him another round of aggressive threats, which, in all their violent glory, were empty, and they both knew it. Bakugo glanced at Todoroki's iced green tea and snorted, almost rolling his eyes out of his head. Can't you at least try and surprise me? Bakugo fixed his drink with an unnecessarily condescending, judgmental look, and Todoroki just took a sip. Yeah, cold and Japanese, boring, blah blah. He looked at what Bakugo had ordered, and now that was unexpected. Bakugo was the type of guy that seemed like the only thing he drunk was the blood of his enemies, but he'd gotten himself a strawberry smoothie. It was very pink and very sweet-looking, and Todoroki continued to drink without saying a word, though he kept staring at it, eyebrow raising slowly. Bakugo noticed, and promptly flipped him off. "Did you get that in order to surprise me then?" Todoroki asked neutrally, knowing the answer was no, but unable to resist having a go at it anyway. Bakugo just gave him a look and Todoroki returned it evenly. "Well done, if so, I'm genuinely surprised you allow your body to consume sugar. There are so many things packed into that one sentence that you're asking for a beating for, it's almost impressive." Bakugo growled around that nasty, threatening grin, and Todoroki took it as a compliment. "What's more impressive is the amount of self-control you're showing recently. You didn't even try to kill me just then," Todoroki pointed out, voice dully raised like a teacher soullessly praising a little kid for a shitty drawing. Bakugo slammed his hand down on the table, palm facing upwards, fingers curved at the ready. "Don't test it, asshat." Bakugo's snarl of a grin stretched back even further to show more of his tightly gritted teeth. Todoroki just hid a smile behind his cup before putting it down and raising his hands in casual surrender. He glanced at his cup, deciding it wasn't cold enough. He produced a few ice cubes from his palm and dropped them in, something he did sometimes without really thinking about it, but Bakugo was staring at him like he'd done something unusual. Or offensive, it was hard to tell based on the look on Bakugo's face. "What?" "Nothing, just thinking that your quirk is, unsurprisingly, stupidly convenient." Bakugo snorted and lifted his own cup to take a sip. Todoroki regarded him for a second, then casually reached over and touched the cup with a fingertip of his left hand, warming the entire drink up. Bakugo immediately gagged on what must be disgustingly lukewarm strawberry smoothie and ripped the cup away, shooting him a murderous glare. Todoroki held a laugh in. "Yes, very." Todoroki replied mildly and Bakugo scowled at him then at his cup, clearly not knowing what to do with it anymore. Todoroki was amazed that Bakugo still hadn't tried to kill him for messing with him. And he would feel a little bad if he'd ruined Bakugo's drink for him for no reason, so he gestured at it. "Here." Bakugo looked skeptical but handed it over anyway, and Todoroki cooled it back down with his right hand. Bakugo arched an eyebrow and swiped it back as soon as the frost dissipated. "Don't f with me and let me drink in peace, Halfie." Bakugo griped and paused, looking at his drink for a moment. He muttered almost inaudibly, "Convenient." And for some reason that made Todoroki laugh, lowering his head and hiding his face with his drink as he snickered at the split second of fascination slackening Bakugo's features. "The F were you laughing at, Air-con?" "Air-con?" Todoroki revisited a thought he hadn't had in a while, that his brain must have short-circuited at some point because that was somehow hilarious to him. He could safely say that no one had ever thought to call him Air-con before. It made sense that he could warm up or cool down the air surrounding him at will, and sometimes subconsciously as well. Sticky summers and frigid winters had never been an issue for him. But in any case, Todoroki had to duck his head down into his chest to hold back his laughter, shoulders shaking with the effort. He was laughing so much around Bakugo recently. It was nice. Bakugo didn't take it well, unsurprisingly, seeming to have finally reached his rage limit, and promptly blew up half of their table. "Don't you laugh at me, sheet for brains I'll kill you dash." Todoroki ignored Bakugo's near incoherent bellow to quickly send the alarmed civilians around them apologetic looks, though he was in too good of a mood to care much right now. "Oh no, what's that guy's deal? He seems dangerous." "Yuara? That uniform, they're UA students, aren't they? So he's not a villain, right? It just blew up the table? Are we safe?" "Oh, those are the semi-pro heroes Shuto and Dash." And Todoroki thought to himself again, being Bakugo's friend was definitely no easy task. They were going to get an earful from Aizawa once he heard they'd been out in public, in their school uniforms no less, destroying other people's property. Todoroki calmly took out enough cash from Bakugo's wallet while he was distracted by rage to cover the damage and placed it on the still intact part of the table, before standing up to wordlessly bow to the shocked cashier to apologize on Bakugo's behalf. God knows Bakugo wasn't going to do it. Too bad for Todoroki and his pride and usually clear moral compass that he liked the messy a-holes so much that he didn't even care in that moment, that he had to clean up after his public ragings. He just grabbed Bakugo's wrist and tugged him out of the store, a smile twitching at the corners of his lips the whole time as he fended off violent attacks with casual flicks of ice. Bakugo of course fought him every step of the way, but in the end he still let Todoroki drag him away, which he wouldn't normally let anyone else do. Todoroki's entire body tingled with warmth. Once they'd reached a quieter street leading past a riverbank and Bakugo finally stopped literally hissing and spitting, Todoroki let go of his wrist. He hummed a little, still smiling ever so slightly at the late afternoon sun, feeling lighter than air. It was so stupid. Bakugo literally hadn't done anything but scowl and yell at him as usual, but Todoroki felt elated, something so bizarrely foreign he wondered if he'd been hit on the head or something. Just spending the afternoon with him, doing nothing of importance. It shouldn't make Todoroki feel this ridiculously light and happy, but it did. Jesus Christ, you're practically skipping. Why are you looking like you're having the time of your diamond life, icicle? Bakugo growled in annoyance, every word grating through gritted teeth, but what was new? I don't skip. I'm walking normally as I always do. Todoroki pointed out mildly just to PSS him off some more, though it was true. He knew other than a tiny little smile he was barely showing that he was happy on the outside, but Bakugo could just tell, couldn't he? It made him want to start skipping. He cut off Bakugo's incoming indignant or infuriating reply with a small shrug. And well, I am having the time of my life. Bakugo threw him a look that suggested he wanted to cut open Todoroki's head to check if there was a brain inside. Halfie, I know you're the most boring person to ever exist on this planet, but we got a cheap drink each. We didn't even finish it before I broke a table and you dragged me out of the store. And we're currently walking. We've done absolutely nothing that should make you feel anything close to that. We've barely done anything at all. Are you broken? Bakugo asked in his most seriously, trying to demean and degrade for optimum devastating results of opponent crushed entirely condescending tone. Todoroki just hummed some more at that, considering his words. Bakugo gave an exasperated scoff. Maybe. Todoroki replied simply, tilting his head back and riding the waves of his current floaty high to give Bakugo a proper, unreserved smile for the first time. Bakugo's body jerked like an electric shock had just run up his spine. It was kind of funny, the slack, stunned expression on his face, but the look in his relaxed eyes glowing brilliantly red in the sunlight was similar to how he'd stared at him in a daze that one time they'd been studying in his room. And Todoroki felt like he understood what that look meant a little more now. Todoroki coughed, suddenly feeling a little, not shy, just not 100% as confident as he was a second ago. He averted his gaze to look ahead instead, using his quirk to cool his face down, though he was struggling with it a little and almost produced frost across his skin. Bakugo gave a loud, frustrated growl. Why do you effing look like that? Bakugo muttered like a curse, but it sounded like he was mostly talking to himself. Todoroki blinked, briefly translating that from Bakugo's speak in his mind. Was that a compliment? Like what? Todoroki asked carefully, chancing a quick look at him. Bakugo's irritable scowl was more aggressive than ever, but he refused to meet Todoroki's eyes, glaring a hole in the footpath before him, hunched over with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He was a little embarrassed. Like sheet, you ugly fucker. Bakugo further confirmed that by stuttering a little, the insult he spat out sounding feeble and unconvincing, and Todoroki really wanted to kiss him. Instead, Todoroki just suppressed a smile and continued walking beside him as the sun began to set, content to take it easy and not read too much into things for now. The girls were scary when they were drunk, Todoroki found. Even though Japan as a whole was pretty lax on the whole underage drinking thing, it still wasn't a good idea for underage heroes in training to drink. It was terrible publicity. So UA'd stress some rules against alcohol in the dorms, but by their third year Aizawa had pretty much told them, do whatever you want as long as you don't damage school property or put anything online. And so, Class 3A would drink and party sometimes in the dorms. Todoroki wasn't too much of a drinker, since he didn't particularly like any alcohol. He wasn't a lightweight, but he couldn't hold a candle to the bottomless vats that were Bakugu, Tokoyami, Shuji, and unexpectedly, Aoyama. The rest of the class's alcohol tolerance reflected their personalities pretty accurately, Todoroki thought. Mineta, Midoriya, Hagakure, Uraraka, Koda, and Kaminari were terrible lightweights. Ashido, Shiro, Kirishima, and Jiraiya were okay at holding their alcohol, but drank the most and got the drunkest and rowdiest. Azui, Ida, Ojiro, Satu, and Yaoyorozu drank a moderate, responsible amount and got moderately drunk. Todoroki belonged to this category, he supposed. He just didn't actually ever get drunk, tipsy at most. But in any case, the girls were scary when they were drunk. He loved and respected all his classmates, and knew all the girls were strong and confident and sensible, but well, when they were drunk they all seemed to turn into stereotypical little girls. Especially when they chose a target, and that target was usually a cornered boy. Today, apparently that boy was Todoroki. He didn't really mind their drunken behavior or the overbearing attention, he just quietly went with whatever they wanted, generally. As long as they were having fun, he didn't really care. Todoroki-kun, you have to let us put makeup on you. Hagakure was insisting, an alcohol flush hovering in what seemed like empty air where her cheeks supposedly were. It was always a strange sight. Todoroki looked around. Not everyone was drinking tonight, it seemed like only the girls and Kaminari had taken some shots, and half of the class were upstairs in their rooms still. Other than Todoroki, Azui, Ashido, Jiraiya, Hagakure, Yaoyorozu, and Uraraka, there was Kaminari, Shiro, and Kirishima, playing, what looked to be very violent, card games on the floor a few meters away. He'd sat himself on the couch with a cookie, and the girls had somehow all ended up sitting beside him or hovering around, once they'd gotten a few drinks in. He was surrounded, so he supposed it couldn't be helped. He just blinked his consent and Ashido, Uraraka, and Hagakure cheered in excitement. He didn't exactly know what the appeal was, it was probably just funny to them, so he just sat still and allowed them to have their way. He was sleepy. Yaoyorozu materialized some things, and they got to work, giggling all the while. Fuyumi had never worn makeup, so Todoroki had no idea what anything they were holding were. His eye was poked once, but otherwise the girls seemed comically intense in their focus despite their drunken swaying and tittering. Oh my effing god! Jiraiya burst out laughing after taking one look at Todoroki once they were done. The rest of the girls admired their masterpiece with badly held-in laughter as well, tilting Todoroki's head this way and that. Kirishima looked up at them and immediately howled with laughter, banging his fist on the carpet. Todoroki vaguely remembered his face looking similar when Bakugo had come back from his internship with Best Jeanist with a hilariously out-of-place, brushed-down side part. Todoroki dash. Kaminari seemed about ready to choke with laughter, and Todoroki held in a sigh. His classmates? But really he didn't mind. Why you have to see yourself? Shiro chortled and Todoroki resigned himself to his fate, casually producing a flat shard of ice from his palm and looking at his reflection. Well, it was clear none of the girls were experts. Neither was he, but he was sure the lipstick was meant to be on his lips. There was blush on his jaw, and some shiny white stuff on his forehead. Funnily enough, the makeup around his eyes actually looked pretty normal, pretty well done. He assumed it had been Yaoyorozu's handiwork. It was just, well, even normal winged eyeliner just didn't look normal on his face. It's beautiful. Todoroki spoke in his flattest monotone, and everyone cracked up even harder. He wordlessly poured himself a shot and tossed it back. Yeah, there was no way he was staying sober for this. Oh god, you have to go terrorize someone like this? Who's an Asho dash? Uraraka gasped between giggles and she was cut off with an immediate chorus of, Mineta. Oh dear. Todoroki silently prayed for himself. The girls liked bullying Mineta sometimes when they were drunk, and honestly, no one in the class cared because Mineta deserved way more than playground insults. But it looked like he was the messenger tonight, terrifying makeup and all. Okay, I've got it. Jiraiya announced, slamming her hands down on the couch cushion and leaning forward with a leering grin. Todoroki, go knock on his door and profess your undying love for him. Oh my god. Yes, we have to watch this. He'd sheet his pants. Oh my goodness. Hell yeah. Rest in peace, Todoroki-chan. Todoroki reconsidered his earlier thought that he didn't mind as long as the girls were having fun. Oh my god, we have to write you a script. Feel free to ad-lib though. You can take the makeup off as soon as you're done. The goal of tonight is to make my Netta cry. The resounding cheer that met those words made Todoroki down another 3 shots in a row. Yeah, he definitely could not be sober for this sheet tonight. He glanced at the girls literally writing a script for him, and wondered if he was allowed to voice objections. But his conscience won out. It's not nice to confess to someone as a joke. It might hurt their feelings. Todoroki pointed out quietly, knowing he'd hate it if someone did that to him. The girls all turned their heads to stare owlishly at him, a predatory gleam to their eyes. It's my Netta. Who gives a sheet? He deserves way worse. He should feel flattered you're even talking to him. Jairu responded coldly, and Todoroki almost wanted to hold up his hands in surrender at the look in her eyes. Okay, he knew the girls actually did care about my Netta as a fellow classmate when push came to shove, but demon, when they were drunk, the frustrations of my Netta's daily harassment and comments turned them ruthless. Yeah, plus he's the straightest thing to exist since rulers were invented. He'd be appalled to have a guy confess to him, that little piece of sheet. Don't you worry about hurting his paper-thin fragile feelings, actually, please do if you can. Ashido added cheerfully, and Todoroki thought about it for a moment, and decided he agreed with their sentiments. He wasn't above helping the girls vent some of their usual stress caused by Minetta's vexingly inappropriate behavior. Let me see that script. Todoroki tossed back another shot and briefly thought that he was drinking a bit recklessly, taking shot after shot like this, but he knew his body's tolerance. The girls all hooped. Oh hell yeah. It up, Todoroki. Ashido practically screeched in victory, and he couldn't help a smile of his own as he read the ridiculous lines the girls had written for him. Someone had clearly been reading too many romance novels. On normal days he'd feel like throwing up saying these lines to anyone, let alone Minetta. Oh no, he could feel the telltale buzzing in his head indicating that he'd drunk a bit too much already. Well, he hadn't eaten yet and he did just have 5 shots in under 2 minutes, after all. This couldn't bode well. But hell, even Todoroki wanted to have fun sometimes. He stood up decisively, taking one more shot he was probably going to regret, lines more or less memorized. Oh, of me. Todoroki immediately muttered as the room swayed a little, and his classmates, immature as they were, immediately started squealing and wolf whistling. I'm sure everyone here would love to, my handsome dude, but none of our health insurances can cover the damages of trespassing on Bakuga's territory, I'm afraid. Kaminari's drunken drawl came from somewhere on the ground, and Todoroki felt the room lurch, confusion spiking in his already hazy head. Why'd Bakuga's name come up? Kaminari, you absolute egg. Shut up. Let them figure it out themselves. Ashido shrieked and launched herself over to him to slap a hand over his mouth. Todoroki was confused, brain not working as fast as it normally did. He looked around at his classmates for an explanation, but found himself being shoved and ushered towards the stairs to carry out his mission. Never you mind that, Todoroki-kun. Let's go make Mineta-kun uncomfortable. Hagakure tugged at him enthusiastically, and Todoroki internally shrugged, pushing that to the back of his mind. He tripped once going up the stairs to the 2nd floor, which was already a bad sign, but the haze in his mind was numbing him to his usual caution in all things. His classmates all huddled in the stairwell, pretty badly hidden, but Todoroki just snorted and turned to walk towards Mineta's room. Hey Frosty! Todoroki jumped as Bakugo appeared at the foot of the stairs leading down from the upper floors. He turned to greet Bakugo, movements a little sloppier than he'd like, and Bakuga's eyes popped when he caught sight of Todoroki's face. Not that it matters, but this wasn't my koic dash, Todoroki explained calmly, but Bakugo just burst out laughing, clutching at his stomach. It wasn't a kind laugh, but it was a friendly type of mockery, the same as his other classmates. The FS on your face? Jesus Christ, you look even dumber than usual. Are the girls drunk again? Bakugo lifted a condescending eyebrow, eyes flickering over to the group tittering in the stairwell. Yeah. Looking pretty, Ice Queen. Bakugo smirked and Todoroki just gave him a lopsided smile and waved his fingers, casually releasing a little puff of tiny specks of ice imitating snowflakes. Bakugo arched his eyebrow almost up into his hairline, peering at him. Holy shit, you're drunk too. What are you doing here anyway? Todoroki just gave him a more secretive smile and held a finger up to his lips, feeling giddy as both alcohol and the mystified look on Bakugo's face drove his feet confidently to Mineta's door. He knocked and heard loud shushing and badly suppressed giggles behind him. The door opened a crack and Todoroki had to look all the way down to try and see Mineta's eye peeking out, feeling like he was about to topple forward. Jesus, the guy was so short. Mineta opened the door fully to point up at Todoroki's face and laugh, a reaction Todoroki was now fully accustomed to. What the F dash, Todoroki? Todoroki kindly resisted telling him that it was the result of the girls touching his face. He had a feeling Mineta might have an aneurysm out of jealousy. Mineta, I need you to listen to me carefully. Todoroki started in his usual deadpan voice and Mineta immediately tensed and drew back a step. What? You're creeping me out. Mineta, self-preservation instincts seemed to kick in as Todoroki swayed a little closer, and Todoroki thought of the little notes the girls had written on the paper and dramatically dropped to his knees. He had zero coordination right now and the swift slam hurt like a beach. But it was worth it, seeing Mineta's eyes go almost fully white in horror. Also, it was sadly hilarious to him that he was still taller than Mineta while kneeling. All my life I've dreamt of you, Todoroki stated tonelessly, but he discovered the deadened, seemingly serious voice, adding to his unblinking deadpan stare seemed to be getting to Mineta more. What the fing sheet? Mineta shrieked and immediately tried to back into his room to slam the door shut. Todoroki lunged forward and gripped the door to keep Mineta from closing it, arm shaking just a little with the effort. The guy really wasn't very strong after all. And Todoroki was. He slowly bore down on him, pushing the door back bit by bit and leering his deathly blank face closer and closer into the shadow of his room. He probably looked like something out of a horror movie right now. His classmates sounded like they were choking on air behind him, so he took that as a signal to keep going. The stupid script came surprisingly easily to his foggy mind. Run away with me. Swear you'll be true to me, and I'll devote my all to you. I'll make you happy dash. Todoroki reached forward to grab at him. He wasn't sure what his end plan was, but Mineta punched his hand away with all his might, and wow, that actually kinda hurt. Is your head broken? Mineta screeched in equal parts of terror, disbelief and rage, and refocused all his efforts onto trying to shut the door on him. Todoroki wasn't done yet, so he shifted his foot and promptly froze the entire door and door frame in place. Plus ultra. Todoroki murmured dramatically, holding out his right hand and producing what he tried to make look like a crude bouquet of ice flowers. Mineta looked ready to faint. Plus dash. Ashido almost screamed from the stairwell at his added touch, and Todoroki patted himself on the back, unceremoniously dumping the flowers at Mineta's feet. He swayed forward ever more and flung out his hands theatrically, still maintaining the same expression. Day in day out, I think about you always. Give me a chance, minor. What was your name again? Todoroki scrunched up his face in a genuine effort to try and remember the guy's first name. Yikes, he was a terrible classmate. You're effing wasted. Mineta screamed, throwing a flurry of those sticky things from his head at him in a desperate attempt at self-defense. Todoroki froze them in a sheet of ice like a shield and tossed it away to clasp his hands together before him. Just wasting my life away without you. Todoroki punctuated the bland, sorrowful words by hanging his head down, going completely off the script now. Dimon, he should have gone into theater. Was it too late to think about a career change? Oh my g dash. Someone was shrieking behind him and the rest of them sounded barely able to keep it together, and Todoroki just grinned. The grin must have been sudden and lopsided and scary, and Mineta almost jumped out of his skin, screaming bloody murder as Todoroki grabbed his arm and casually tugged him out of his room, freezing the gap between the door and the frame to cut off his escape route. This was stupid. But it was fun, so Todoroki couldn't give two sheets about how he was going to regret this in the morning. Someone help. Todoroki's gone crazy. Holy, get the F away from me. Mineta was full on crying and Todoroki just continued to ad-lib as encouraged to, because it was fun. Crazy in love with you, that I am. Todoroki replied gravely and he was sure Mineta was going to start bleeding from sheer force of terror soon. Leave me alone. I'm not gay. Mineta hollered as if that needed to be confirmed, and Todoroki just took it in his stride and leaned his face in uncomfortably close. But I am. Todoroki murmured, keeping his eyes flat and 100% serious because, well, he was. He ignored the tiny voice in his head that reminded him he just came out in front of everyone and continued with his act, playing the gay card to bland completion with a soulless snap of his fingers and a flat wink. Begone! Mineta all but roared, and before he could try attack again Todoroki scooped him up and froze him securely to the top of his doorframe by the back of his collar. Look, everyone! The love of my life. Behold! Todoroki declared with the same monotone, turning around and sweeping an arm up to gesture at Mineta hanging from the doorframe, ignoring his yells of protest. Everyone was doubled over and wheezing, tumbling out of their hiding spot to come over to him. Bakugo was on the floor, rolling around in an uncontrollable fit of loud, raucous laughter. He looked like a child, and Todoroki couldn't help but smile like an idiot, a million cliché butterflies setting off in his stomach as he saw that he'd made Bakugo laugh like that. Holy shit, Todoroki, what happened to you? Kirishima crowed, slapping him on the shoulder, hard. Todoroki stared pensively off into the distance. Love makes you a fool. That was it for Kaminari and Ishido, who joined Bakugo on the floor, choking on cackles. Yaoyorozu was still having trouble composing herself as she produced what looked like a tissue from her arm. You can dash. Yaoyorozu cut herself off with another giggle and held it out to him. You can use this makeup wipe. Honored. Todoroki replied and that set her off into another peal of laughter. He smiled anyway, happy to see Yaoyorozu laugh so openly like this. He really was very happy to see all of his classmates like this, knowing he'd somehow been the cause. Making people laugh wasn't something he'd ever been in the center of attention for before. It was nice. He guessed it was okay getting drunk and acting like an idiot every once in a while. He took the makeup wipe and walked a little off to the side, his job done for the night. He almost stumbled into the wall, still dizzy and uncoordinated, but quickly righted himself, hoping no one had seen as he rubbed his face vigorously with the wipe. Of course someone had, though, who let him know with an obnoxious drawl. You all right there, princess? Bakugo called and Todoroki wiped at his face a little harder, hiding his face for a few more seconds. Peachy. Todoroki surfaced to deadpan, and Bakugo just snorted, gesturing him over. Come here. It was just a short, casual word, but Todoroki felt his heart shoot up into his throat. He tried his best not to trip in the meter and a half he had to travel over to him, and was a little ashamed to find how hard that was. He made it there in one piece and Bakugo snorted again, taking the wipe from his loose grip, loose mainly because his hands were so annoyingly numb right now, sheet. OF dash, Todoroki must have miscalculated and overshot the distance, because he realized that he was standing really, really close to Bakugo, and his face, his pretty, obnoxious face was just right. His relaxed red eyes were bright with amusement, and Todoroki could see how long his eyelashes were. Todoroki was in no state of mind to control the blush that rose to his cheeks, but he hoped he could brush it off as the alcohol. Bakugo just stared at him for a moment, an unnamed something dancing in his sharp eyes, and Todoroki swayed. Bakugo, what dash? Todoroki mumbled and Bakugo seemed to snap out of it, shaking his head a little. You missed a spot. Bakugo replied and it was quiet. It was so quiet and soft, like he meant to say something else far more important, like he only wanted Todoroki to hear. Todoroki's heart thudded at the unbelievable softness of his voice, feeling his world tip upside down, although that may also be because of the alcohol. What? Bakugo could speak like that? He wanted to hear more. Bakugo raised the wipe up to his face and Todoroki made a confused sound but held still as Bakugo gently? Bakugo? What was going on? Swiped at the corner of his mouth. His face was so close. Todoroki couldn't focus on anything Bakugo was doing, dazedly staring at his unusually calm eyes directed downwards. Wow, pretty. Bakugo lifted the wipe up more and paused, hovering near Todoroki's left eye. Todoroki felt a different type of intoxication, drunk in a way that had nothing to do with alcohol, blinking slowly at him. Why was there a sudden flash of hesitation in his eyes? Todoroki trusted him. What was wrong? Your scar. Does it hurt? Can I touch it? Bakugo murmured, so softly Todoroki felt his head spin. He was half convinced he was dead, or had been transported to some parallel universe. Or maybe he was so drunk he was hallucinating. But God, did it make him giddy, and he just nodded, a little shyly. What the F dash? He didn't get shy. What was going on? But that careful, searching look in Bakugo's eyes, it was clearly messing with Todoroki's alcohol-ridden brain. It doesn't hurt, Bakugo. Todoroki replied equally softly, and Bakugo flattened his lips a little, pausing for a second longer. Then he pressed the wipe ever so carefully against his scar right beneath his eye, and dabbed at his mottled, hardened skin like it was made of glass. Todoroki giggled as he saw how intensely focused Bakugo was for something so dumb, but he still felt a dizzying rush travel up his body as Bakugo stared intently at his closed eye. Bakugo faltered, looking caught off guard, expression open and relaxed, and, "You're pretty." The words tumbled out of Todoroki's mouth in a rush, accompanied by another giddy laugh he couldn't hold back if he tried. He finally said it. It felt good. Bakugo looked like he'd just been punched in the stomach. He gaped soundlessly at him for a few moments, the makeup wipe dropping from his frozen hand. "Why you need your eyes checked, stupid sheet?" Bakugo seemed to try for his usual scowl, but it was clearly forced. His cheeks were pink, his eyebrow twitched, and he had this fight or flight look about him. Todoroki just laughed again, a little louder, a little more openly. Bakugo visibly swallowed. When he spoke again his voice was rough, like something was caught in his throat. "Who's the real pretty one here?" Todoroki blinked at him, waiting for the words to settle and click properly. "Are you calling me pretty, Bakugo?" Todoroki almost grinned, aiming to lean closer just a bit but ending up lurching forward, and Bakugo quickly caught him by the arms before he smashed their heads together. "Jesus Christ, you are so FNG drunk. Go sleep it off already." Bakugo grumbled, cheeks even pinker than before, and if Todoroki was a brighter person he would have cooed. As it was, he just smiled some more. Tonight was truly a breakthrough. His facial muscles had never had this much exercise, and decided Bakugo's suggestion sounded like a really good one. Yeah. Todoroki mumbled before he let his eyes slip shut and his body collapse. A bit further down the corridor, their classmates watched the whole scene in rapt awe, no one making a sound, even as Todoroki suddenly passed out and Bakugo quickly held him upright with a loud, startled curse. "What are you watching?" Siro whispered, as if afraid to break some sort of spell. Ashido was trembling so hard she looked like an impending explosion. Kirishima was wiping tears away with the back of his hand, and the rest all had their jaws on the floor. "Did you see that? Did you effing see that?" Ashido whisper shouted, excitement practically burning off of her body as steam. "Did you see how motherfucking gently Bakugo was touching him?" "Forget that, he was speaking and we couldn't hear it." Who the heck knew Bakugo had a quiet voice too? Uraraka sounded like she was about to pass out. Bakugo went out of his way to do something as sweet as help Todoroki clean his face. Bakugo was helping, "Oh God, I can't." Kirishima sounded on the verge of full-out sobbing, and Kaminari just patted his shoulders solemnly, letting him grab onto him for support. Todoroki-kun was smiling and laughing all over the place. Todoroki-kun was smiling and laughing. "Oh my God, I feel like we should have taken pictures." Hagakure squealed and Ashido and Jairu immediately groaned. "We should have taken pictures. We would have made bank." Half the girls in this school would pay good money to get a shot of Todoroki smiling. Shudo looked so happy. Yaoyorozu pressed a hand to her chest, a little teary-eyed as she stared at the normally self-sufficient, aloof boy, asleep and leaning his entire weight against Bakugo, fully trusting and comfortable. They both did. Bakugo-chan and Todoroki-chan were fully immersed in their own quiet little world. I'll bet both of them completely forgot about us. Ajui's observant ribbit was as fond as it had ever been. Can you let me down now? Mineta's distressed voice interrupted the oohing and awing, and Jiraiya shot him an uninterested glance. It'll melt. Probably. So you're just gonna leave me up here till it does? Get Todoroki to him. Actually no, I don't want Todoroki anywhere near me, that creep. Mineta shuddered, and Ashido rolled her eyes, about to reply to that when an aggressive voice cut in. You actually think Todoroki would be genuinely interested in you for a second, berate trash? Quit your whining and grow the F up, purple sheet. Bakugo sneered coldly and let off a small, controlled explosion that shot out from his hand and shattered the frame of ice. Mineta dropped to the ground and gaped and waved his hands around, but wisely didn't talk back. Wow, I agree with Bakugo for once. Amazing. You wanna die, earlobe freak? This is such a beautiful moment. Ashido sniffled, and Uraraka shot her a wary, disbelieving look. You mean Bakugo-kun threatening to kill one of us as usual? No, silly, look at him. Look at how he's carrying Todoroki. Ashido practically yelled, clearly still pretty drunk, though some of the others were sobering up a little and getting sleepy one after the other. And it was a sight, Bakugo carrying the taller boy bridal style in his arms. Actually, it was a sight seeing Bakugo carry anyone. Of his own accord as well. And what if any of it, Mina? Halfie's out cold, he sure ain't walking downstairs himself. Useless adish, Bakugo shouted in that usual burst of irritation but immediately cut himself off when Todoroki gave a sleepy mumble and turned his head to press his face against the crook of his neck, white hair plastered against his skin a little messily. The girls could barely decide whether to squeal over Todoroki's slightly squished sleeping face or the immediate color in Bakugo's cheeks. I would just like to thank the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit for allowing me to live to see this day. Oh, the blessings we've received tonight. Ashido slapped her hands together in a crude prayer, and Bakugo gave a vicious growl only tempered by the blush that had yet to disappear from his face. You're all a bunch of crazy dumbass. I can't deal with you, I'm going back to bed. Take icy hot, and fucking look after him, alright? Stupid BSDRDs had way too much to drink. He probably needs to lie down on the couch. He always locks his room when he's not in there. Bakugo grumbled and griped and unceremoniously dumped Todoroki onto Kirishima. Nobody said anything for a beat. Oh my god, Bakugo actually cares about another human being. Jiraiya whispered, and the others immediately burst into squeals and laughter again. Huh? You really got a death wish tonight. Discount present, Mike. Bakugo shouted and Kaminari fell over backwards at the new nickname, but quickly surfaced to fix Bakugo with a sly look. Why'd you give him to us? Why don't you go and lie him down somewhere? Kaminari asked a little challengingly and Bakugo practically seethed at him. Because I just FNG told you, fried brain idiot. He locks his room dash. Bakugo spat through gritted teeth. No one was even going to touch the fact that he knew what Todoroki did with his room when he was out or whatever else. Then why don't you take him to your room? You have a bed, no? Kaminari's voice was continuing to rise in pitch with a less than appropriate lilt, a sharp smirk splitting his face. A few of the students groaned at him while Bakugo didn't seem to realize what he meant, preoccupied with yelling at him. Why would I take him to my room for as dash? Only because you desperately want to, blasty? Kaminari crowed with a downright salacious grin, and Bakugo looked like he'd just been frozen to the spot, though their resident ice maker was, thankfully, still out cold. This conversation suddenly turned inappropriate. Ajui commented calmly as Bakugo, literally, exploded into incoherent screams and enraged blasts. It's true though, have you seen him gawking and drooling when he watches Todoroki train? It's disgusting, and what's more disgusting is that he hasn't done anything about it yet. Kaminari continued to dig his grave deeper and the others were split between whooping and cheering him on with equally nasty grins, and struggling to slap their hands over Kaminari's mouth before Bakugo committed murder tonight. God, shut the F up, Mineta 2.0. It was an extremely close call, But when Kirishima stood in front of Kaminari as a hardened human shield and Bakugo caught sight of Todoroki still sleeping on his shoulder, he seemed to collect what was left of his sanity and stormed his way up to his room. But not without threatening them all with a fate worse than death if they didn't properly make sure Todoroki was all right. Ashido repeatedly sobbed that it was the best day of her life. Todoroki woke up what felt like seconds later, with his head on Yaoyorozu's lap, back on the couch downstairs. He tried blinking his swirling surroundings into focus and yep, he was still drunk. "Yaoyorozu, how'd I get here?" Todoroki rasped, and Yaoyorozu jumped in surprise at his sudden question. "Oh, you're awake?" "Ah, that," Yaoyorozu suddenly giggled, brushing a lock of his hair out of his eyes. "Bakugo was adamant that you lie down here properly and rest. He made absolutely sure we would take care of you, and disappeared back to his room after all the teasing annoyed him." "He what?" Todoroki mumbled, eyes widening in shock. Yaoyorozu had a knowing lilt in her voice, and Todoroki was too out of it to care about appearances at this point. He just allowed himself a small grin and turned over onto his side to hide his face in Yaoyorozu's hip. His mumble turned quieter, happier. "He really can care, can't he? Yaoyorozu, Idiamen. I really like him." "Yeah? He's the one you like then?" Yaoyorozu's confirmed softly as she ran her hand through his hair, and Todoroki nodded, grin widening a little. "Yeah. I was going to tell you sooner or later, but you probably picked up on that ages ago. But I just really like him." Todoroki sighed, touching his scar lightly where Bakugo's fingers had brushed so carefully. "Geez. Drunk him was really mouthy. And he makes you happy." Yaoyorozu's voice was full of affection, and Todoroki just could not stop smiling like an idiot tonight. "Yeah. He makes me so happy." Todoroki echoed quietly, warmth filling him from head to toe as he imagined a cranky Bakugo telling his classmates to look after him. "It looks like you make him happy." "At least, no one else can make him look that way." Yaoyorozu murmured and Todoroki laughed, more a puff of breath than anything else. "You think?" "I think so too. I hope so." Todoroki fell asleep on the couch with his head pillowed on Yaoyorozu's lap, satisfied to the brim with every bizarre, pleasantly surprising thing that had happened tonight. Sometimes, he concluded, it was nice to get drunk. Todoroki woke up with the worst headache of his life. It was no surprise. He hadn't had a drop of water since before he got sheet-faced drunk last night. Last night? He struggled to sit up, feeling the world slip and slide as he did. He was still on the couch, with Ashido, Kaminari, Uraraka, Jairu and Kirishima passed out around him, some half on top of a couch, some fully on the floor. Todoroki just blinked blearily at them for a few dazed seconds, wondering what time it was. It was bright in the room, too bright and hurting his dry, throbbing eyes, so probably midday. Thankfully it was a Sunday. He felt something solid and plastic hit the back of his shoulder and he felt a huge, uncharacteristic surge of irritation at the dull pain. Hung over him clearly wasn't the most pleasant or patient. He turned, with difficulty, everything was spinning slowly, to shoot a glare over his shoulder but froze when he saw Bakugo giving him a half-amused, half-mocking grin. "Awake, princess? Drink that, you look like complete sheet." Bakugo informed him kindly as always, and Todoroki glanced down at the water bottle beside his lap. He pushed down a smile. How thoughtful. He had no time to be embarrassingly smitten first thing in the morning though. As soon as he downed half the bottle, feeling his parched, sandpaper throat begin to feel like it belonged inside his body again, he felt his stomach churn. "Sheet," Todoroki uttered calmly, before sprinting to the bathroom. He could hear Bakugo's laughter drift after him. Drinking, Todoroki decided as he crouched beside the toilet bowl after throwing up for about 15 minutes, was a terrible idea and he should never do it again. What even happened last night? He vividly remembered the girls drunk and laughing around him on the couch, remembered feeling sleepy as they put makeup on him, and then what? There was just this huge blank. He remembered so clearly that he wasn't going to drink, having planned to have an early night's sleep. But clearly, judging from his emptied stomach contents, he'd not only drunk but had far too much. Todoroki didn't like not being in control of himself and not knowing what he'd done. He rinsed out his mouth at the sink and splashed water over his face, wincing as a spike of pain shot through his head. He wandered back into the living room, pressing his right hand to his head like a makeshift ice pack. His quirk really did have its perks. Bakugo was nudging Kirishima with his foot, clicking his tongue in annoyance and crouching down. Todoroki watched, a little mesmerized and little worried for Kirishima's safety, as Bakugo roughly slapped him awake. Kirishima mumbled something groggily and Bakugo just snorted and maneuvered his head upright carelessly. He popped a pill into Kirishima's mouth as it was open mid-sentence with the air of someone who had done this way too many times, casually tossing some water from the bottle in with it and clamping Kirishima's mouth shut. Todoroki briefly entertained the thought that Bakugo had finally snapped and was poisoning him, as he watched Kirishima choke and swat Bakugo's hands away while trying to swallow it. "Kirishima, should I call an ambulance?" Todoroki spoke up just in case, and Bakugo slid him a flat, unimpressed look, obviously knowing exactly what Todoroki was implying. "It's a fucking painkiller. I have to do this sheet every time these useless losers get smashed." Bakugo drawled irritably as usual, getting up with a casual kick to Kaminari's stomach. Kaminari groaned and mumbled something in his sleep. He glanced up at Todoroki again for a second. "Want one healthy? I've got a lifetime supply at this point." Todoroki surveyed the scene, observing the sheet of pills held in Bakugo's hand, the water bottle in the other, a bucket that hadn't been there before he went to the bathroom, a few ice packs and more water bottles laid out on the coffee table. "Bakugo, are you the mum friend?" Todoroki asked fully seriously, but Kirishima, who just seemed to have recovered, immediately choked again. "Thief, does that mean snowflake?" Bakugo almost crushed the pills in his hand and Todoroki just gestured around. "You've got a lifetime supply of painkillers to take care of your hungover friends with, as you said, and you're clearly very used to taking care of them." Todoroki pointed out reasonably, he thought, but Bakugo still seemed to take offense. Todoroki didn't mean it in an offensive way, though. "Just because I don't leave these dumbasses to die because their pea-sized brains don't ever effing learn dash. Ah, shut up, Blasty, just accept it. You're the mum friend of the Baku squad and we owe our lives to you, mother." Kirishima crooned from where he still lay half propped up against the couch and Bakugo delivered a swift punch to the back of his head. Kirishima howled in pain. "Bakugo, my head already kills. Have mercy." Bakugo easily ignored him and glanced around at the others still out cold. "Mina, Kaminari and Gyral wanna wake up later. Dunno about round face. She probably won't like waking up to my face. Whatever. I put the water there already, she can sort herself out once she's awake." Todoroki hid a smile behind his fist. He doubted Bakugo even realized, but he really could be quite sweet sometimes. "Oi Todoroki, you want hangover soup?" Bakugo called over his shoulder as he made his way over to the kitchen, tossing the water bottle back at a still groggy Kirishima. Todoroki blinked in surprise, trailing after him a little slower. His head still felt like it was about to split open. Hangover soup sounded like a dream. "You can make hangover soup?" Todoroki confirmed as he took a seat at the counter, half surprised, half hopeful. "I can make amazing hangover soup, you useless, spoilt young master." Bakugo shot back at him with a note of challenge ringing in his voice, and Todoroki just took his word for it. Bakugo was really good at cooking after all, among everything else. "I'd like some, please." Todoroki replied, ignoring the young master jab. Out of all of Bakugo's insults, that was probably the one he liked the least. But it wouldn't do to be rude to the guy that could cure your hangover. "Coming right up, young master." Bakugo's voice sang with disdainful mockery, and Todoroki rolled his eyes, and immediately regretted it as it set off another spark of pain in his aching head. Bakugo just had to go and be annoying on purpose. "Thank you." Todoroki decided to keep being polite anyway, more than accustomed to Bakugo's allergies to civil interactions by now. He spotted a pot already sitting on the stove, with some cut-up vegetables and pieces of meat set to the side on a cutting board. Bakugo must be preparing it to be ready for whenever the others woke up. Todoroki couldn't suppress his smile for the life of him. And people thought Bakugo had no emotions other than anger. He couldn't believe he'd never gotten up early enough after drinking to see the ridiculously domestic sight of Bakugo cooking breakfast soup for his classmates. He just stared for a few moments, or maybe 100, at Bakugo's back as he went about cooking the soup, feeling warmth settle low in his chest. The pounding in his skull only seemed to worsen, and Todoroki winced. He pressed a hand to his head and carefully froze the entire surface of his hair in what he knew was a ridiculous-looking helmet of ice. But whatever. As long as it worked. And oh, sweet relief. Holy shit, you look dumb as hell. You must be even more of a hungover wreck than I thought. Bakugo had turned with a loud, surprised burst of laughter at the sight of him, and Todoroki just lazily opened one eye to regard him blankly. It's good to prioritize health and survival over appearances, Bakugo. Todoroki explained with a quiet drawl, and Bakugo snorted, turning back to the stove. Sure, goldfish bowl. Is that what it looked like? Todoroki hummed to himself, closing his eyes again and hunching forward to rest his cheek against the counter. He couldn't leave his head covered in ice for long, so he reluctantly melted it with his other hand, raising the temperature almost painfully high to make it evaporate immediately, rather than drench his face and neck. But he was sleepy still. What felt like a second later, Todoroki felt a warm hand nudge his shoulder, and he slowly blinked open his eyes. He must have dozed off. Eat. Todoroki's eyes focused on the gently steaming bowl of soup beside his face. He pushed himself up with a grimace, throbbing head not keen on giving him a break for a second, it seemed. Bakugo was standing opposite him on the other side of the counter, arms folded with that endearing pout scowl on his face that meant he was waiting for Todoroki to do something. Todoroki stared at him blankly for a few seconds, not comprehending, then it clicked and he quickly tried some of the soup. It's good. Todoroki spoke simply and Bakugo's scowl deepened, irritation flashing across his features. Oh, don't give me your famous obnoxiously unimpressed attitude. You think you could do better, half and half BSRD? Bakugo growled, clearly a bit seriously ticked off, which he wasn't usually around Todoroki nowadays. Todoroki just sighed, shaking his head. Typical Baku, looking for a fight even when it wasn't there. I couldn't. I'm saying it's good because it is good. Thank you for letting me have some. But you can't expect me to give you some huge reaction because it's not surprising. Everything you make is really good, you're really good at cooking. Todoroki elaborated casually, taking another sip. Bakugo looked like he was struggling to find words. He scratched agitatedly at the back of his neck, and Todoroki wordlessly took it as an embarrassed thank you. Yeah, I fucking am, but you... Geez, when you enjoy something and are grateful for it, you could FNG show it on your stupid pissy face. Bakugo grumbled, shoving his hand in his pocket and lifting a coffee mug up to his mouth. Todoroki raised his eyebrows slightly. He didn't know Bakugo drank coffee. Very fittingly, it looked like a straight shot of espresso with no milk or sugar in sight. You're very literally the last person I want to hear that from. Todoroki deadpanned, and Bakugo just snorted, setting his mug down with a slightly louder thud than necessary, just because he was Bakugo. Drunk you is a fucking ray of sunshine compared to normal you. I should have treasured it while it lasted, before you got your shitty snark back. Bakugo clicked his tongue, lip curled a little, but there was no real malice in his sneer. Todoroki was about to retort that Bakugo had no business talking to anyone else about snark, but he paused. What was drunk me like? Todoroki tried to sound offhand about it like he didn't care either way, but Bakugo's eyes snapped open wide. You don't remember any of it? Todoroki refused to pout, but it was a close thing. He didn't remember any of it and he really, really hated it. He hoped he hadn't done anything stupid, but surely he wouldn't have. He wasn't exactly a very impulsive person. He had some more soup and glanced back up Bakugo, who was regarding him with a strange expression. Fill me in. FING hell. Well, I wasn't downstairs when you guys started drinking, so I dunno about then. I only saw you when you were on the second floor. You were already wasted. Bakugo took a leisurely sip of his coffee and Todoroki frowned, digging through his foggy brain to try and connect the dots. What was I doing on the second floor? I didn't know either, you just had a shit ton of terrible makeup on, Those other drunk dumbasses were watching from the stairs and you clearly knew what you were doing while it was happening, because you signaled me to be quiet and went up to Ballhead's door. Bakugo raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement dancing in his eyes as he clearly replayed something in his mind. Todoroki blinked, fragments of the memory slowly coming back to him. The girls told me to profess my undying love for Mineta. Todoroki recalled abruptly, and Bakugo snorted. Figured. That's why my head hurts like sheet. I took 6 shots in a row. Todoroki muttered half to himself, and Bakugo scoffed, raising a judgmental eyebrow. No wonder you were so shit-faced. For the record, dunno if you remember, but you were f***ing hilarious when you were actually talking to Purple Trashcan. Never laughed that hard in my life. Bakugo smirked into his coffee and Todoroki just stared at him for a moment, trying to figure out if Bakugo was joking. Are you making fun of me? Todoroki asked blankly, frustration mounting as he desperately tried to remember what he'd apparently done. Bakugo apparently laughing. Bakugo raised his eyebrows. Surprisingly, I'd say you were the one making fun of yourself with that performance. Oh, and you came out in front of everyone and froze Mineta to the top of his door frame. Bakugo added casually like it didn't matter, and Todoroki almost balked. What? The dash, Todoroki immediately stopped, not trusting himself to speak. Should he be more concerned about the fact that he'd accidentally declared his sexuality? How would that even have come up? Or the fact that he'd spontaneously decided to freeze his classmate to a door? Or maybe the fact that these two events apparently coincided. He knew his classmates wouldn't really care about both, but he'd rather have made a logical, conscious decision to do either of those actions. There was an uncomfortably long pause as Todoroki quietly reflected on his life choices, and Bakugo coughed, scratching his head. Well, yeah, didn't know you were gay, Halfie. Bakugo sounded like he was trying for casual, and Todoroki just looked at him slowly. Really? Todoroki asked in monotone, and Bakugo held his flat stare for a second before snorting. No. Todoroki rolled his eyes, taking another sip of soup. Bakugo might have been trying to be considerate about it or whatever, but Todoroki was well aware that his classmates already knew. It wasn't too hard to guess. Did anything else happen? You passed out in the middle of the corridor, and then I went back to my room and they took you back downstairs, and these half-wits apparently carried on drinking because they don't value their lives. Yaoyorozu and them went up to bed though. Bakugo explained carelessly, raising his coffee back up to his mouth. Todoroki blinked, wondering why Bakugo wasn't meeting his eyes. Somewhere in his foggy memory he thought something else had happened. Didn't it? He remembered seeing Bakugo's face really, really close. He remembered feeling a rush of giddiness, of warmth that filled him from head to toe. Was that just his imagination? Why couldn't he remember? When I was drunk. Todoroki started hesitantly, stopping as Bakugo looked at him. Did what? Did you stand really close to me? Did we talk at all? Did you make me laugh? Or did I dream that or something? Any way of verbalizing this question was embarrassing as hell, not to mention that the terribly blurry images in his head were most likely just his infatuated imagination. Todoroki coughed a little awkwardly and looked down, trying to will away the slight color in his cheeks as he braced himself to ask, hearing Bakugo's soft voice in his head. He hated how small his own voice was as he forced himself to speak. Did you call me pretty? That was not the question he'd meant to ask. Out of all the embarrassing. Holy shit. Please don't let him have heard that, by some miracle. Bakugo looked at him stiffly, and Todoroki immediately regretted his entire life. He waved a hand a little frantically in dismissal, coughing awkwardly some more. Holy shit, who even actually asked their crush if their own fantasy about them happened? Was he an idiot? Bakugo sounded a little strangled and Todoroki s***ed in a sharp breath and waved his hands a little more desperately, struggling to maintain his usual composed expression. Oh, Jesus, don't take me too seriously, sorry. I was really drunk and my mind's a little confused, just, never mind. Todoroki had never once stuttered or rambled in his life and it did not feel good to start now. Bakugo was still staring at him strangely and Todoroki could barely breathe, feeling like he was steaming with embarrassment. He fished around for something to say, quickly remembering what they'd been talking about before his disastrous mouth ran off with itself. Right, yes, be normal. What? Is he still there? Mineta, on the doorframe. Sheet, I should apologize. Todoroki winced thinking about it. He usually didn't purposely mess with or antagonize any of his classmates, or anyone really, so he felt pretty bad. Also, if his ice was strong enough to keep someone in place, or in this case stick someone to a surface, it would not melt unless he consciously melted it, or he himself suffered physical damage. So it was most likely still there. Bakugo just remained tense for a few moments of silence, before something flickered in his eyes and he relaxed again. No, the purple fucker's not still there. Calm down, strawberry shortcake. Bakugo rolled his eyes derisively and Todoroki looked at him in question. He looked a little annoyed. Well, he always did, but this seemed to be specific. Annoyance. It was tempting to just leave him there, but I knew your stupid noble conscience would make you feel bad in the morning, so I broke the ice and freed him. And don't apologize to him. Todoroki blinked in surprise. It was just something small, and something that anyone should have done anyway, but Bakugo had done that of his own accord just so Todoroki wouldn't feel bad? Jeez. Why did Bakugo always make it so damn hard for him to hold back a smile? But Bakugo also looked a little genuinely set at something, his tone a little more aggressive than normal, and Todoroki tilted his head. What do you mean, don't apologize? And, do you hate Mineta or something? I hate everyone. Bakugo announced firmly and Todoroki had to suppress a giggle at the immediate flat, typical response. Bakugo's eyes narrowed as he looked off to the side, flat and sharp and dangerous. But well, I don't give a shit about him more than anyone else normally, but he was grossed out by you after you played that prank on him. He thought it was real or some shit and was damn rude about it. Fucker should have felt flattered if anything. So F him, you don't need to apologize to that piece of shit. Todoroki had no words. He just stared at him mutely, lips parted in surprise. What could he even focus on first? Bakugo saying that Mineta should have felt flattered? The anger sparking in his eyes as he spoke, as if Mineta being possibly a little rude to Todoroki really mattered? Todoroki jumped when he suddenly heard Kirishima's voice right beside his ear. You look dumbfounded and so am I, but let me help you out here, Todoroki. Bakugo's feeling protective of you. Todoroki turned to stare at him in surprise instead, he'd forgotten he was even here, and Kirishima barely got a wink in before Bakugo chased him up the stairs in a fit of explosive fury. Todoroki sat there blankly, listening to the screams and explosions echoing from the floor above. Protective? Oh my god. It hadn't been a dream, had it? His brain suddenly cleared for a blessed moment, allowing Todoroki to remember Bakugo speaking to him so softly, looking at him so closely, touching him so carefully, awkwardly telling him he was pretty. Oh my god. Todoroki's brain short-circuited for a moment. What? What's that smell? Oh my god, fire. Holy shit, fire in the kitchen. Todoroki set the place on fire. Oh shit, sorry dash. Todoroki never brought it up in case Bakugo wanted to save face. He'd really been acting so out of character, after all, he was probably embarrassed thinking about it. And Todoroki was okay with that, because the most important thing was that he knew Bakugo wouldn't regret it, like he didn't regret doing anything. Todoroki just quietly cherished the memory in his head, but it certainly made him bolder over the next few days. Bakugo, can I try something? Todoroki asked less for permission, more as a warning to let Bakugo know he was about to do something, so try not to. Instinctively blow him up, please. Bakugo lifted his arm from his eyes, fixing him with a wary look. He looked a little sleepy still from his peaceful dozing, spiky hair shadowing his eyes as he stared up at Todoroki with his arms still hovering in the air. Todoroki silently prayed Bakugo wouldn't still try to make his surroundings explode, but it was infinitely better that they were outside right now at Bakugo's favorite napping spot, on the usual grassy bank by the classroom, rather than inside a building. He reached out and gently grabbed Bakugo's hand, intertwining their fingers and holding on firmly. Bakugo's entire body stiffened, hands spasming in Todoroki's hold. Neither of them said anything for several long moments, and Bakugo didn't hold Todoroki's hand properly, fingers still open and loose, but he didn't pull away or get angry either. That spoke volumes, and Todoroki couldn't help his soft, happy smile. I was right, it is sweaty. Todoroki mumbled to himself, and that made Bakugo rip his hand away, scowling in disbelief as he sat up. Well, my fucking apologies for having sweaty. Wait, you've ever thought about my hands being sweaty before? Bakugo sounded about 2 seconds away from murdering him, and Todoroki just gave him a soft, imploring look, effectively freezing him, not literally, in place. I'm not complaining, I just mean, I've thought about it before. Your quirk activates from your nitroglycerin like sweat, and you can form explosions whenever you want, so the logical conclusion is that your hands would be at least a little clammy all the time. Todoroki explained placatingly, though it just looked like it weirded Bakugo out. Bakugo continued to stare at Todoroki like he was some new, unidentified life form. Well, what? So you just wanted to test if you were right. Why are you thinking about me and the dumb side effect of my quirk, anyway? No, I've just thought about holding your hand before. And what it'd be like. Todoroki replied quietly, staring down at his own hand. Bakugo's breath hitched, and Todoroki was a little afraid to look up to see what look was on his face. He was being way too blunt and forward this time, wasn't he? The implication of that was practically a confession as well. Todoroki hadn't thought about what it might be like getting rejected, because he hadn't ever really thought about confessing before. He was just going with the flow, doing whatever he felt like, saying whatever he felt like, just spending time with Bakugo and getting to know him, and that had been enough. So now, he just held Bakugo's hand because he wanted to as usual, but this was different. Maybe his original curiosities had let him get ahead of himself and possibly spoil what he had right now. He swallowed and squeezed his eyes shut for a second, not wanting to even think about that. Then slowly, like he was fighting himself, Bakugo reached out and took his hand, linking their fingers. Again. Todoroki almost flinched, snapping his head up and staring at him with what he could feel was a stupidly obvious, vulnerable expression, and Bakugo stared back without saying a word, his gaze filled with something. Then his eyes relaxed like Todoroki had never seen before, angry lines smoothing away, a soft gleam warming those usually fierce red irises. Todoroki could feel himself melt. He stared at their clasped hands and smiled again, feeling a warm, happy haze settle down over him as he memorized the shape and feel of Bakugo's calloused hand. His fingers were a little shorter than his own, but the frame was broader, and Todoroki didn't by any definition have small hands, but they felt small just then. He could feel the whisper of destructive power lying just beneath those fingertips that pressed against his skin, yet he'd never felt safer. Bakugo's hand wasn't actually really sweaty or anything, it was just slightly noticeable, especially compared to the constantly cool skin of his own right hand. But it was definitely clammier now than a minute ago, and Todoroki thought perhaps he was a little nervous. It was weird, entertaining the thought that Bakugo could be nervous of all things, but he squeezed his hand gently, hoping for the gesture to come off as supportive. He activated his quirk through his right arm and carefully lowered the temperature of his hand, precisely so he didn't accidentally freeze Bakugo. Bakugo clearly noticed, hand twitching, narrowing his eyes just a fraction. You're doing that on purpose. Bakugo's voice was startlingly quiet, and Todoroki's temperature fluctuated sharply for a second despite himself. Bakugo raised an eyebrow and Todoroki felt his cheeks flush, hurriedly balancing it out again. To cool your hand down, yeah. Why, is it uncomfortable? Todoroki murmured, maintaining the temperature now as he felt Bakugo's palm begin to cool and dry to match his own skin. Bakugo didn't say anything for a few moments, staring down at their hands with an unreadable expression. Looks like holding your hand is dangerous for me. Bakugo eventually muttered, the tiniest hint of a dry laugh in his tone. Todoroki blinked. What? I can't use my quirk now, can I? Bakugo slowly untangled their fingers and drew his hand away just a little, curving his fingers in his usual preparatory hold to detonate blasts in his palm. But only one tiny little spark went off, and it dawned on Todoroki that Bakugo's weakness was cold temperatures, wasn't it? He remembered from Bakugu's stats in class that he got stronger the more he fought and the more he sweated, and so the opposite meant that he was unable to fight if he couldn't sweat much, i.e. when he was cold. Oh, Todoroki mumbled, looking down and feeling guilty? For whatever bizarre reason, he felt a little guilty for trying that just then, and more than a little disappointed that his quirk was potentially dangerous or a weakness to Bakugu. Even if he hadn't been doing it consciously just then, he knew just the air around him and his skin in general tended to be much cooler than other people. Ah, shut up, loser. Stop looking so pathetic. Did I blame you for it? Bakugu scoffed, but it was quiet, and he reached out to wrap his fingers around Todoroki's hand again, purposefully reaching for his right rather than his left. It was so unlike Bakugu, who was unexpectedly cautious during a fight against an opponent he knew the abilities of, though it never looked like it, to push aside the clear danger to and weakening of his quirk when he usually did everything he strategically could to not place himself at a disadvantage. And yet, it was also so like Bakugu at the same time, to face any adversities head-on, bold and confident even in the face of a weakness, that he could overcome any obstacles and come out victorious. Todoroki was no coward either, so he listened to the happy buzz in his chest and scooted right over to Bakugu to press himself lightly against his side. Bakugu didn't push him away or even say anything, as Todoroki rested his head against his shoulder with a content smile. Then, one day as Todoroki was stacking dishes in the dishwasher, he heard hushed voices in the living room. Did you hear? Apparently, Bakugu kissed Ishido.